Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember the day started like any other. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and the air smelled sharp, like it was about to snap. I was out hiking alone, something I'd done many times before. There was a trail I wanted to explore deep into the woods, a place most people avoided because it was thick, tangled, and a little wild. I wanted to see what was beyond the parts everyone else stuck to find a quiet spot, away from people and noise. I set off early in the morning, the ground wet and soft under my boots. The path was narrow, barely a worn line through the trees, and branches brushed my jacket as I moved slowly. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I felt calm at first, breathing in the cool, damp air. The trees stood tall and close, their trunks slick with moss. The sky was overcast, so the light that filtered down was weak and muted, casting long, uneven shadows. As I walked deeper, the trail got harder to follow. Fallen leaves covered the ground thickly, and small bushes started to creep across the path. I had to duck under low branches and step over roots that twisted like thick snakes. The quiet settled in again, but it felt different now, heavier, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't see another soul, which was exactly what I wanted. I carried a small pack with water, a flashlight, some snacks, and a first aid kit. My phone was in airplane mode to save battery, but still kept close, just in case. Even so, I knew the signal would probably cut out soon, like it always did in places like this. Around midday, the rain started, light at first, just a few drops. I pulled my hood up and kept moving, the trail growing steeper. The woods began to close in tighter, trees leaning over the path, their branches knotting together to form a thick canopy that blocked most of the sky. The air felt colder, damper, and the ground got muddier, sucking at my boots. I crossed a small creek by stepping carefully on some slick stones. The sound of the water running was loud in the stillness. For a moment, I stopped and listened. The forest was oddly silent except for the creek. No birds, no insects, nothing but the water's flow and the soft thud of my boots on mud. That's when I noticed the first thing that made me uneasy. Off the path, a few feet into the trees, there was something strange, a pile of sticks and branches arranged in a rough circle, like someone had been trying to build a shelter or a trap. It looked crude, unfinished, and out of place. I didn't want to get too close, so I kept my distance but studied it carefully. The thought crossed my mind that maybe someone else had been out here recently. Maybe hunters, campers, or people who lived off the grid. I didn't see any footprints clearly because the mud had started to cover everything, but the arrangement seemed deliberate. I felt a tingle in my neck, a warning I didn't want to ignore. I decided to push on. The trail kept going uphill, steeper and more difficult. The rain grew heavier, and my jacket was getting soaked through. My boots were muddy and slippery, making each step more dangerous. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I just needed to reach the ridge I'd read about on an old map. After maybe another half hour of climbing, I reached a clearing at the top of a small hill. The trees opened up, and I could see the sky again, dark and thick with clouds. The wind was stronger here, cold and sharp. From the clearing, I could look out over the forest, an endless sea of dark green trees stretching far away. I wanted to stop and rest, so I sat down on a fallen log. My heart was pounding a bit harder now, but I tried to steady my breath. I looked around the clearing carefully, noticing that the ground here was trampled, like someone or something had been there recently. Broken twigs and flattened grass showed signs of movement. I felt watched. I looked deeper into the trees beyond the clearing, scanning the shadows. For a moment, something flickered in the corner of my eye, a movement too quick to catch. I strained to see, but only caught the shifting of leaves and branches. No figure, no clear shape. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It grew stronger, heavier, pressing against my skin like cold hands. I got up quickly and started back down the trail, the rain now pouring hard enough to sting my face. The ground was slick and slippery, and I had to watch every step. On the way down, the forest seemed to change. The usual sounds of rain hitting leaves were drowned out by other noises. Soft cracking, rustling, something faint but steady. It was too slow to be wind, too rhythmic to be just animals. I kept moving, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But every few seconds, I caught that sound again, like branches snapping underfoot or twigs breaking. Sometimes it seemed to come from just behind me, other times ahead. I checked my phone to see how far I had left. No signal. Panic started to creep in. I quickened my pace, but the trail was getting worse. The rain had turned the path into a thick, slippery mess, and I slipped a few times, barely catching myself. The forest around me grew darker as the clouds thickened. I didn't want to look back, but the noise kept following, matching my steps. Then, just as the sun began to fade behind the clouds, I heard something sharp and sudden, a loud crack, like a branch breaking close by. I stopped dead and spun around, heart hammering, eyes darting through the wet trees. Nothing, just rain and shadows. I took a breath and tried to move again, but the feeling that something was out there, watching and moving with me, was overwhelming now. I kept my flashlight ready, clicking it on to cut a narrow beam through the gloom. The rain hit the light, making it hard to see far, but the beam caught shapes of trees and leaves. Suddenly, the light caught a glimpse of something, a figure, maybe, half hidden behind a tree. It was blurred and dark, but the shape was wrong, unnatural. It didn't look like an animal I knew. It stood still for a second, then vanished. I swallowed hard, fighting to keep calm. There was no way to call for help. I was alone, miles from the trailhead. My boots slipped again on the muddy ground. The rain felt like it was soaking me through to the bone. I started running. The noise behind me exploded, branches snapping, heavy footsteps pounding on the wet earth, breaking twigs. Whatever it was fast, bigger than me. I could hear it closing the distance. I ran harder, trying to find the trail. My legs burned, my lungs gasped for air, but I couldn't stop. The flashlight beam flickered as I stumbled over roots and stones. I barely saw where I was going. The path was gone. I was in thick forest, no trail, nothing but trees pressing in all around. The footsteps were closer now, loud and heavy, like something chasing me. I tripped and fell, hitting the ground hard. Mud covered my face, my hands scratched on wet bark and dirt. I scrambled up, terrified and desperate. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. For a long, endless moment. Then a heavy breath, low and close. I didn't dare look. I ran again, blindly, crashing through the brush. The rain was a curtain in front of me. I heard nothing after that breath. No chasing, no footsteps. Just the pounding of my heart. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trees thinned. I burst through the edge of the forest into a small clearing, drenched and shivering. I looked back once. No sign of anything following. I stayed in that clearing, trembling, until the rain stopped. I waited until the sun started to peek through the clouds again before moving. Then, carefully, I found a nearby dirt road that led back to civilization. When I finally reached my car hours later, soaked, exhausted, and muddy, I locked the doors and sat in silence. I kept my eyes on the forest line, half expecting to see something watching me still. But there was nothing. That day changed something inside me. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what I saw or what followed me, but I know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be explored alone. The silence, the dark shapes, the footsteps, they are warnings. And ignoring them could cost you everything. I still think about it often. The feeling of being hunted, the cold breath close behind me, the rain blurring everything. It stays with me, a shadow on the edge of my mind, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not made-up stories or monsters from books, but real and silent, hiding just beyond the trees. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, though I had no reason to be awake yet. It was still dark outside, and the air in my small bedroom felt heavy, almost damp. I lay there for a while, staring at the faint outline of the curtains, listening to the distant hum of nothing in particular. My body felt restless, and for some reason I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be somewhere else, like I shouldn't just lie there. Eventually, I gave up trying to fall back asleep and got out of bed. My feet touched the cold floor, and I could feel how quiet the house was. It wasn't the usual calm, peaceful kind of quiet. This one felt sharper, more tense, like the walls themselves were listening. By the time I finished making a quick breakfast, the sun was just starting to show. Pale light crept across the kitchen counter, touching the edge of my coffee cup. I had the whole day to myself, and instead of sitting around, I decided I'd head out for a walk. There's a trail about a mile from my place that cuts through some woods, and though it's not exactly famous, I've walked it plenty of times. It's quiet, you hardly ever see anyone else, and it winds deep enough into the trees that it feels like another world. I dressed light, grabbed my jacket, and slipped on my old hiking boots. Outside, the air was cold enough to pinch the tip of my nose, but the kind that wakes you up, not the kind that makes you miserable. The street was empty as I walked toward the trail entrance. The only sound was my footsteps against the sidewalk and the occasional rustle of wind brushing through the leaves above. When I reached the trail, I noticed right away how still everything was. Usually, even early in the morning, I'd hear birds calling or squirrels darting in the underbrush. That day, nothing. The trees stood tall and dark, their branches arching over the path like they were trying to keep the light out. I started walking anyway, letting my boots sink slightly into the damp dirt, each step leaving a clear print behind. The trail narrowed as it wound deeper. The smell of wet soil grew stronger, and I could see patches of moss climbing up tree trunks, glistening faintly from the moisture in the air. I kept moving, my pace steady, and for a while, the stillness was actually calming. But about half an hour in, I heard something. It was faint, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped listening, and there it was again, a single solid crack, like a stick snapping underfoot. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trail behind me. The path stretched empty for as far as I could see, with nothing but the same dark trees and their tangled shadows. I waited a little longer, trying to catch another sound, but nothing came. Telling myself it was probably just a deer or a stray animal, I kept going, though I noticed I was now paying more attention to the space behind me than ahead. As I moved deeper, the trail began to change. The dirt became softer, more like mud in places, and I had to watch my footing. There were sections where the roots of old trees jutted up across the path like knotted veins, forcing me to step over them carefully. I could feel the forest pressing in on me, the trees standing closer together, their shadows thicker. Another sound came, a low, drawn-out scrape. This one was closer, too close to ignore. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. It was too slow, too deliberate, like something dragging along the ground. My hands instinctively curled into fists inside my jacket pockets, my breath coming slower. I looked back again, but the trail was still empty. I kept moving, faster now, but trying not to make it obvious. My ears strained to catch every little noise, and I thought I heard the faint, rhythmic crunch of footsteps behind me. They didn't match mine. They came a second or two after each of my steps, like someone was following, but holding back. The trail eventually forked into two paths. I hesitated, trying to remember which one looped back toward the main road. I chose the left, mostly because it seemed to angle upward slightly, and I figured higher ground might give me a better view of what was around me. The incline was gentle at first, but the mud made it harder to climb. My boots slipped once or twice, leaving smears of dark brown across the path. That's when I heard it again. This time, a sharp inhale, the kind you make when you're trying not to breathe too loudly. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of heat under my skin despite the cold air. I didn't turn around this time. I didn't want to see. I just kept walking, but I could feel it. Whoever or whatever was behind me had closed the gap. The higher I climbed, the more the trees thinned out, but the light didn't feel any warmer. The sky above was pale and flat, offering no comfort. I could feel sweat starting to gather at the back of my neck, and my legs were beginning to ache. I tried to keep my steps steady, but the urge to break into a full sprint was growing. I reached a curve in the path, where it bent sharply around a cluster of rocks and fallen logs. As I rounded it, I glanced back quickly, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting between two tree trunks, too tall to be an animal. My stomach dropped. I picked up the pace, breathing harder now, my eyes flicking from the trail ahead to the ground at my feet. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. My legs were already burning. The path began to dip, and I realized I was heading downhill toward a small clearing. From here, I could see the faint shimmer of water through the trees, a creek I'd crossed before on past hikes. The creek meant I was still far from the trailhead. If I stayed on the path, I'd have another 20 minutes before reaching the road. That was too long. I decided to cut through the forest directly, hoping to shorten the distance. I stepped off the trail, pushing past low branches and crunching over dead leaves. The ground here was uneven, littered with rocks hidden under thick patches of moss. Moving off trail was slower, but I kept going, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The forest seemed denser here, and the air was heavier. My breath sounded too loud, each one puffing out in small clouds in front of me. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound, louder this time, followed by a steady crunch of footsteps. I crouched low behind a fallen tree, my back pressed to the damp bark. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. I could hear only my heartbeat thudding in my ears and the faint trickle of the creek somewhere ahead. My legs ached from crouching, but I didn't move. After what felt like forever, I slowly rose, keeping my head low, and started toward the creek. My boots sank into the soft earth near the water's edge, and I could smell the cold, mineral scent of it. I followed the creek upstream, hoping it would lead me closer to the road. The further I went, the more the sound of the water masked any other noise. But that also meant I couldn't hear if anything was behind me anymore. I risked a glance back and saw nothing, but the unease didn't leave me. My shoulders were tight, and every muscle in my body was on edge. After several minutes, I spotted a break in the trees ahead, where the creek curved sharply. Beyond it, I could see the faint glint of metal, maybe a guardrail along the road. Relief flooded me, but I didn't let myself slow down. I pushed through the last stretch, my boots splashing in the shallow water, until I reached the edge of the trees. The road was right there, empty and silent. I stepped out from the forest, my chest heaving, and turned to look back one last time. The trees stood perfectly still, their shadows deep and unbroken. But I knew. Something had been there, following me every step, staying just far enough to keep hidden. I never went back to that trail again. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel the weight of that presence at my back, silent but unshakable, and the way the forest seemed to hold its breath until I was gone. I got home that day with mud on my clothes and a tightness in my chest that didn't ease for hours. I didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to explain, nothing to prove, just the fact that I'd been followed, and I'd made it out before finding out what would have happened if I hadn't. It started as just another day, nothing out of the ordinary, the kind of day where you never think you'll remember the details. I had been invited to help a friend clear some brush on a piece of rural property he'd recently bought, miles away from the nearest town. The land stretched for acres, a mix of open fields, overgrown trails, and patches of dense woodland. I had been out there once before during the day, but only near the main path. This time, the work would take us deeper in. We spent most of the morning cutting away tangled vines, hauling branches, and stacking piles of deadwood. The sky was clear, and the air felt warm but not oppressive. By the time late afternoon came, my friend had to leave for a family errand, but I stayed behind to finish stacking a final section of cut logs. I wasn't worried. I had my phone, some water, and the trail back to the truck was straightforward enough, or so I thought. By the time I was ready to head back, the sun was already low. The light filtering through the trees was turning gold, then orange, casting long shadows across the ground. The air grew cooler, and I felt that subtle shift that always comes before night settles in, the kind where the forest seems to quiet, as though it's holding its breath. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, picked up the last set of gloves and tools, and started toward what I believed was the trail. At first, everything looked familiar. The ground dipped slightly, the way I remembered, and the trees seemed spaced in the same pattern I'd passed earlier. But within 10 minutes, the scenery shifted just enough to make me uneasy. The path under my boots became less worn, the leaves on the ground thicker and undisturbed. I slowed, looking around for a landmark, a broken fence post, a fallen log, anything I could recall seeing before. Nothing matched. I kept moving, convinced that I only needed to veer slightly to one side to rejoin the main trail. But the further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches nodding overhead and dimming the light. My boots sank slightly into softer earth, and I began noticing a faint smell, wet soil mixed with the sharp, damp scent of decaying leaves. It wasn't panic yet, but the thought was there, tapping in the back of my mind. I pulled out my phone, only to see one bar of service flicker and vanish. The screen's map showed my location, but the signal kept dropping, and each time I zoomed in, it froze. I shoved it back in my pocket and kept moving, scanning the ground for any kind of trail. Minutes dragged on, and the light kept fading. I could hear my breathing now, loud and uneven in the stillness. Every so often, a branch cracked somewhere off to my left or right. At first, I told myself it was just squirrels or small animals, but the sound didn't match their usual quick scurrying. This was slower, heavier, with a deliberate pause between steps. I'd stop and listen, holding still for long seconds, but it would go silent until I moved again. The air felt heavier the deeper I went, as though the forest itself was closing in. I tried to keep track of my direction, turning my head to check the last stretch of ground behind me, but everything looked identical: thick trunks, moss-covered bark, scattered twigs. There was no clear way to mark where I'd been. I broke a few branches as I passed, thinking it might help, but the moment I glanced back again, the forest had already swallowed the signs. Eventually, I found what looked like a narrow game trail, thin, winding, barely visible under the layer of fallen leaves. I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to a clearing or stream where I could reorient myself. The trail sloped gently downward, and the ground grew slick. The smell of damp earth was stronger here, and I noticed more exposed roots, twisted and gnarled like skeletal hands reaching across the path. That's when I heard it again, the slow crunch of leaves, this time closer, maybe 20 feet behind me. My chest tightened. I didn't want to turn my head too fast, but I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the dim shapes between the trees. There was nothing I could clearly see, just layers of shadow where the last strips of light struggled to break through. I stood still long enough that my pulse began to thump in my ears, but the forest stayed silent. I started walking again, faster now, my boots slipping a little on the damp slope. The trail curved and seemed to drop toward a thicker patch of undergrowth, and I could hear water somewhere ahead, a faint trickle. I pushed through, hoping it was a small creek, but instead found myself staring at a shallow depression in the ground filled with dark, stagnant water. The surface reflected the faint glow of the sky above, but there was no sign of a crossing, no clear path on the other side. I moved along the edge of the water, pushing through branches, feeling them scrape against my arms. Somewhere in the distance, something thudded, dull and solid, like a log falling. The sound wasn't far, and it seemed to echo faintly through the trees. I froze again, listening hard. The thudding didn't repeat, but I caught another noise, subtle, like fabric brushing against bark. My mouth felt dry. The shadows were almost complete now, and my eyes struggled to adjust. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a flashlight, and the beam lit up the immediate space in front of me, a mess of tangled roots, damp leaves, and shifting mist near the ground. The light also caught something else. About 15 feet away, between two trees, was a narrow vertical shape, darker than the surrounding shadows. It didn't move, but the outline was wrong for a tree. I held my breath, the phone trembling slightly in my hand. The shape stayed perfectly still, almost blending into the darkness, and I told myself it could just be a split trunk. But something in my gut told me to move. I turned away from it, forcing myself to walk steadily, but every step felt heavier. The forest was now almost completely silent, the way it gets right before a storm or when a predator is nearby. My flashlight beam kept picking up fleeting details: scratches on tree bark, patches of disturbed leaves, a trail of pressed-down grass that seemed too wide for deer. Eventually, I spotted what looked like a break in the trees ahead. My pace quickened, and I pushed through the last cluster of branches to find a wide, uneven clearing. The ground here was scattered with fallen branches, and the grass was long and unkempt. At the far end, I could see the faint outline of a hill, and beyond that, the lighter sky of open land. Relief started to creep in, until I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. It was a pile. At first, I thought it was just a stack of logs, but as I got closer, I saw the shapes more clearly: animal bones, sun-bleached and tangled together, some still with scraps of fur clinging to them. The smell hit me next, sharp and sour, cutting through the damp air. I stopped cold, scanning the tree-line again. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, pressing down on me until it was hard to think. I didn't wait to see anything more. I skirted the clearing, keeping low, and aimed for the open sky beyond the hill. My legs burned, but I forced myself up the slope, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. When I finally crested the hill, the trees broke, and I saw the faint outline of the dirt road leading back toward where I'd parked. I didn't stop to look behind me. I just kept going, boots crunching on gravel until the shape of my truck came into view. Only when I was inside, doors locked, and engine running did I allow myself to breathe normally again. I glanced once at the tree line in the distance. It was completely still, dark and silent. I drove away without looking back, but the image of that shadow in the trees stayed with me. I don't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely, but I know this: Whatever it was had been there for a while, following just far enough to stay out of sight, and I had no doubt it knew the forest far better than I ever would. The night came on faster than I expected. I was out there alone, deep in the woods, far from any kind of trail or sign of civilization. I had set out earlier that afternoon, planning just a short hike to clear my head and enjoy some quiet. The sun was warm and the sky was clear, a perfect day for being outside. I left my phone off and my pack light, just a small bottle of water, some granola bars, a flashlight, and a pocket knife I carried out of habit. I told myself I didn't want to bring anything unnecessary. At first, the walk was peaceful. The forest around me was thick with tall pines and maples, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. The ground was carpeted with pine needles and fallen leaves, soft under my boots. I could hear birds chirping, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the branches, the distant sound of a creek flowing somewhere off to my right. The air smelled fresh, with a sharpness that only the woods can carry after a dry day. Everything felt calm and safe. As the afternoon slipped toward evening, I found a small clearing beside a shallow creek. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I sat on a fallen log and pulled out a granola bar. I watched the light change through the trees, turning the leaves golden, stretching long shadows across the ground. The peace settled over me again, and I almost forgot I was alone. But the woods don't stay peaceful once the light fades. I started back toward where I thought the trailhead was. I didn't want to be out here after dark. I figured it would be a quick walk back. The forest seemed denser now, the trees pressing in close as I moved deeper. The creek disappeared under the brush, and the sounds of water faded. The sun was dipping low, and soon the sky darkened, bleeding from gold into red, then purple. I switched on my flashlight. The beam cut a narrow circle of yellow light through the dark woods, but beyond that everything was black. The flashlight didn't make me feel safer. It made me realize how deep in the shadows I was, how easily something could be lurking just outside the reach of the light. I tried to keep my breathing steady, my footsteps quiet on the leaf-covered ground. Every snap of a twig underfoot or rustle in the bushes made my heart jump. My mind played tricks on me, imagining eyes watching from the dark or something moving just beyond the trees. I told myself it was just nerves, just my imagination. After a while, the trail seemed to vanish. I could no longer tell where I was heading. I stopped and looked around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The forest was a wall of trunks and branches, tangled roots and fallen logs. The path I had been following had disappeared under a thick covering of leaves and pine needles. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. My heart sank. I realized I was lost. The temperature dropped quickly. The cold settled in my bones as I kept moving, trying to find something, a trail, a clearing, any sign of the way out. The flashlight battery was getting weak. The beam flickered now and then, forcing me to shake it or press the button repeatedly. Each time it dimmed, the darkness seemed to stretch closer. Then I heard it, a low noise, almost like a whisper. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something soft and steady, moving through the underbrush nearby. I stopped. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then it started again, a slow crunch of dry leaves and twigs coming closer. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't move forward either. The sound was definitely approaching, slow and steady, like someone or something following me. I fumbled for my pocket knife, gripping it tightly. My hands were trembling. The crunching grew louder. Then suddenly it stopped. I stood frozen. The silence around me was heavy and thick, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I scanned the edges of the flashlight's beam, searching for any movement. Then I saw it, a shape tall and dark, just beyond the reach of my light. It was standing still, barely moving, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I tried to steady the light again and saw more clearly. The shape was too tall to be a deer or any animal I knew. It was standing upright, and it didn't have the shapes or features of a human. But it wasn't a ghost or monster. There was nothing supernatural here. Just something unknown and terrifying because it shouldn't be here. Then I remembered the stories I'd heard about people getting lost and never coming out of these woods. How sometimes others come looking, but they don't find the missing. How the forest can swallow you whole, leaving no trace. I felt the cold seep deeper into me, mixing with a raw, growing fear. The figure began to move, slow and deliberate, stepping toward me through the dark. I could see the faint outline of its limbs, the way it bent slightly, almost like it was hiding, stalking. My flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into complete darkness. Panic surged. I ran. Branches slapped my face and arms, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't care. I just ran blindly, trying to get away, to find the path back. My breath was ragged and loud in my ears. I stumbled over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees on the dirt and rocks. I forced myself up and kept going, guided only by the faint glow of the night sky through the canopy. The shape was behind me, I could feel it. I didn't look back. Then out of nowhere, I crashed through a thick wall of bushes and hit a slope. I slid down a short embankment and landed on a flat, open space. The moon was bright here, illuminating a small clearing. I collapsed, gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the figure. I stayed there, shivering, listening. The forest was quiet again, except for the usual night sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The fear was still there, tight and heavy, but the worst seemed to have passed. After what felt like hours, I gathered my strength. I looked around the clearing and noticed a faint dirt road cutting through the trees, just a few feet beyond the edge of the clearing. It was narrow and barely visible, but it was there. I stood and took a careful step onto the road. The ground underfoot was hard-packed dirt, not the soft, leaf-strewn forest floor. I moved cautiously but steadily, following the road as it wound through the trees. The forest seemed less hostile now, less threatening. I told myself I wasn't imagining things, that what I had seen wasn't some creature or demon. It was probably just someone or something lost too, maybe a hunter or a drifter. But the fear stayed with me, gnawing at my skin. I walked the road for a long time, the moonlight guiding my steps. Eventually, I heard the distant sound of a car engine. Relief washed over me. I hurried toward the noise and soon found a small gravel parking area with an old pickup truck parked there. The driver was nowhere in sight, but the keys were in the ignition. I sat inside, shivering and exhausted. I started the engine and let it run, my eyes darting around the parking lot and the tree line. After a few minutes, I spotted a pair of headlights coming down the road. The truck rolled to a stop beside me. A man stepped out, looking concerned when he saw me. I was too tired and shaken to explain much, just nodded and pointed back toward the woods. He gave me some water and helped me call for help. I waited there for what felt like forever until someone came to get me. That night, as I lay in a warm bed, safe and far away from the forest, I thought about what happened. I realized how easily the woods could swallow someone whole, how quickly peace can turn into fear. The figure I saw might have been real, or maybe my mind twisted what little I could see. But the feeling, the weight of being hunted, lost, and alone, was all too real. The next morning, I returned with a search team to mark the trail and find where I had lost my way. They told me the forest around there was known for getting thick and confusing, especially after storms when trails get washed out. They also warned me about people who wander off, some not coming back. I never went back alone after that, and I made sure to carry a GPS and extra supplies whenever I went hiking. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I still remember that night. The cold air, the shape in the dark, the sound of footsteps behind me. It reminds me how quickly nature can turn from peaceful to dangerous, and how small we really are when the forest closes in. That night didn't have a neat, happy ending. It was messy and frightening, but it ended with me alive, and that's what matters. The woods aren't full of monsters or ghosts, just the quiet, patient wild. And sometimes that's scary enough. I didn't expect much when I agreed to go hiking alone that morning. It was just supposed to be a simple day trip, a break from the noise of the city, some fresh air, a chance to clear my head. I had my backpack, enough water and snacks for the day, a basic first aid kit, and a map of the trails. Nothing fancy. The weather was clear, a little chilly but comfortable under the early sun. I parked my car at the trailhead just after 8 a.m., took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and set off. The trail was mostly dirt, winding through thick forest with occasional patches of open meadow. The ground was damp in spots from recent rain, but the path was firm enough. I felt good, steady. I kept an even pace, enjoying the quiet around me, only the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls breaking the silence. No one else was around, which I liked. Sometimes, you need to be alone with your thoughts. The first few miles went by without incident. I stopped once to take a drink and eat a granola bar. The sun climbed higher, filtering down through the branches and warming the forest floor. The trail started to climb gently, leading me toward a ridge that offered views of the valley below. I looked forward to that, the kind of sight that makes the climb worth it. As I neared the ridge, I noticed something odd. A faint trail splitting off to the right, narrower and less worn, heading deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on my map. I hesitated, but then shook it off. I had my map. I'd stick to the main trail. Still, curiosity nagged at me. At the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath and look out. The valley stretched wide, a patchwork of fields and forest, the river winding silver in the distance. The view was stunning. I pulled out my phone to snap a photo. Then I saw it, something moving on the far side of the ridge, a figure. At first, I thought it was a hiker, but as it moved, it felt strange. The figure was hunched, walking oddly, not like a person. My skin prickled. I scanned the area, but no one else was visible. The figure disappeared behind a tree. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe a deer or some other animal. I turned back to the trail. That's when I realized my phone battery was dead. I hadn't checked it after taking that first photo. No signal either. Just the forest and me. I decided to continue along the ridge. The trail became steeper, the trees thicker. The air smelled fresher here, cooler. I felt the thrill of being so far from civilization, but also a small knot of unease. I reached a small clearing near the top, where a fallen log lay across the path. As I stepped over it, I heard something, a sharp crack from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sound of branches breaking underfoot, more like a heavy thud. I froze, listening. Nothing else. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or something bigger. Still, I was careful to keep moving. The trail looped around the ridge and began to descend into a denser section of forest. That's when things started to feel wrong. The path became less clear. The underbrush thickened, thorny branches scraping my arms and legs. I had to watch my step more closely. The daylight was fading faster than I expected, even though it was only mid-afternoon. I stopped to drink from my water bottle. The silence was too thick now. No birds singing, no wind stirring the leaves. Even my breathing sounded loud. I felt exposed and small in the middle of all those towering trees. Suddenly, I heard it again, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was my heartbeat, but it wasn't steady. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, but I couldn't tell how far away. I picked up my pace. The trail wasn't straight anymore, curving and dipping, twisting around thick roots and moss-covered rocks. My boots slipped on wet leaves. I glanced back. Nothing, just shadows between the trees. The thumping stopped. I slowed down, chest tight, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was just scaring myself. Maybe it was a branch falling or some animal moving far away. I told myself to focus. Then I tripped on a root and landed hard on my right knee. Pain shot through my leg, sharp and burning. I cursed softly, careful not to make too much noise. I sat still for a moment, feeling the sting, then wiped the dirt and leaves off my pants. I knew I should check for injury, but I was more worried about what might be behind me. I listened again. Silence. I got up slowly and tested my weight on my leg. It hurt, but I could walk. Good enough. I kept moving, slower now. The trail curved sharply, and the trees thinned a bit, revealing a faint light up ahead, maybe the end of the trail or an opening. Relieved, I headed toward it. As I stepped into the light, I found myself at the edge of a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across. The ground was muddy and uneven, scattered with broken branches and flattened grass. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, deep impressions in the mud, bigger than any bear or deer tracks I'd seen. They led into the woods from the opposite side and disappeared between the trees where the shadows were thickest. My heart hammered in my chest. These weren't animal tracks I recognized. They were too big, too heavy. I swallowed hard and took a step back, but my foot slipped in the mud and I almost fell again. The air felt colder, heavier. I glanced around, trying to find a way out, but the path back was blocked by fallen branches and thick bushes that hadn't been there before. Panic surged. I started moving faster, looking for another route. The forest was dense, tangled with vines and trees packed close together. The light faded, leaving me in near darkness. I stopped to catch my breath and pulled out my flashlight, but the batteries were dead. I cursed again. No phone, no light, and no way to find my way. I remembered the tracks and thought maybe whoever, or whatever, made them might still be nearby. I listened. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and moved forward blindly. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scraping my face and hands. My clothes were torn and muddy. Suddenly, I heard it, a deep, heavy breathing right behind me. I froze. The sound was close, slow, and labored. I turned quickly, but saw nothing except thick trees and shadow. The breathing stopped. I stood still, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. I decided to climb a tree, any tree, to get a better view and maybe stay safe for a while. I found a sturdy pine with low branches and started climbing. My leg ached, but I pushed up, pulling myself higher until I was about 10 feet off the ground. From here, I could see a bit better. The moon had risen, casting pale light through the canopy. I spotted the trail leading back toward the ridge, but it was far and winding. I could hear twigs snapping below. Then I saw it, a large figure moving slowly among the trees. It wasn't running, just walking with heavy steps. It stopped and looked up at me. I could see the shape clearly now. Huge shoulders, thick arms, but not quite human. The way it moved was awkward, lumbering, almost animalistic. Fear gripped me. I was trapped up here with no way down that felt safe. The figure stayed below for what felt like an hour, pacing and sniffing the air. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Eventually, it started to move away, disappearing into the shadows. I waited another long time before climbing down slowly. My leg was stiff, but I managed. I took the trail back toward the ridge, careful and quiet, my senses on edge. The forest seemed different now, darker, colder. I walked for what felt like miles, the trail getting steeper as I climbed back. At last, I reached the top and saw the parking lot far below, lights from cars and buildings shining faintly. I ran down the last stretch, my breath ragged, my legs screaming with every step. When I finally got to my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I sat inside, shaking, my mind racing. I thought about what I'd seen and heard, the footprints, the breathing, the figure. I realized that whatever was out there wasn't just some animal or lost hiker. It was something wild, something that belonged deep in these woods. I started the engine and didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tight. The memory of those heavy footsteps and that quiet breathing stayed with me for days afterward. I never went back to that trail. Some places are better left alone. It was supposed to be a simple night hike. I had planned it for weeks, a way to clear my head and get some fresh air after a long stretch of stressful work. The trail I chose was remote but well known, a narrow dirt path that wound through thick woods, following a slow river for a few miles before ending at a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I packed a small backpack with water, a flashlight, a map, and a pocket knife. My phone was fully charged, but I knew signal would probably be spotty, if any at all. The afternoon was clear and warm when I set off, the sun hanging low but still bright enough to push back most of the shadows. The woods were alive with sounds, birds calling to each other, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the steady rhythm of my footsteps felt almost meditative as I moved deeper into the forest. At first, the trail was easy to follow. The dirt path was worn, with roots and stones poking through here and there, but nothing too difficult. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the quiet and the solitude. The occasional passing breeze stirred the leaves, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in long, golden beams. The river ran parallel to the path, its gentle babble adding a peaceful soundtrack. After about an hour, I reached the part of the trail where it narrowed, and the trees grew closer together. The light dimmed under the thick canopy, and the air turned cooler and heavier. I could feel the trail getting steeper as I climbed alongside the riverbank. At one point, I stepped on a patch of loose gravel and nearly slipped, catching myself on a nearby branch. The sudden scare made my heart race for a moment, but I laughed it off, telling myself to be more careful. I kept moving, the forest growing quieter now, as if the animals sensed the coming night. The birds had stopped singing, replaced by the faint croak of frogs near the water's edge. I glanced at my watch, about 30 minutes until sunset. The shadows were growing long and sharp. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkening woods in a narrow cone, illuminating the path ahead. The quiet around me felt almost too quiet. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and steady. The sound of my footsteps was sharp and loud on the dry leaves. I reached the clearing I had aimed for just as the last light faded from the sky. It opened out onto a wide overlook of the valley, the distant lights of a small town twinkling below like stars caught in the earth. The night air was crisp and smelled of pine and moss. I took a moment to sit on a fallen log and rest, feeling the tension in my legs ease. The peacefulness didn't last long. From somewhere in the woods behind me, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft crunch of leaves, like someone stepping carefully but quickly. My head snapped up, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the dark trunks and shadowed undergrowth. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. It was normal to hear wildlife at night in the forest. Still, the noise came again, louder and closer, another crunch, this time accompanied by a faint rustling sound. My stomach tightened. I considered turning back, but I decided to sit still for a moment, trying to listen carefully. The noises stopped. Dead silence. No wind, no animals, no distant water sounds, just silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A dark shape, slipping quickly between the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. I swung the light around, trying to catch it, but it vanished. My heart pounded as I stood up, suddenly feeling very exposed in the middle of the woods with no one around for miles. The only way back was the same narrow path I had come from. I debated whether to wait until daylight or try to head back now. I decided to start walking back, keeping my flashlight steady and scanning every shadow. The trail was uneven and covered in fallen leaves, making it harder to hear approaching footsteps. I moved quickly but carefully, afraid of tripping in the dark. After 5 minutes, I heard the noise again. This time, definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, following the rhythm of mine but staying just out of sight. My pulse quickened. I stopped and waited, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped too. I turned sharply, shining my light in every direction. Nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now, trying to ignore the creeping fear. Suddenly, the beam of my flashlight caught something near the side of the trail, a pair of eyes reflecting the light, low to the ground and watching me. I froze. The eyes blinked and disappeared into the darkness. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I clenched my fists and pushed onward, trying not to look back. Minutes later, the trail split into two. I recognized the path I had come from, but the other was unfamiliar. I checked my map, but in the dim light, the details were hard to make out. I chose the path that seemed most like the way back. That was a mistake. The trail narrowed further, and the trees closed in tighter. Branches scraped my arms, and the uneven ground made each step a careful effort. The noises started again, faint and irregular, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, something large moving just beyond the trees. I stopped and listened. Then, the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. It was close. Too close. I spun around with my flashlight, but again saw nothing. Panic set in. My mind raced with possibilities. Wild animals, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, though those were rare here. Or something worse, someone following me. I quickened my pace, my breath ragged in the cold air. The sounds grew louder behind me, footsteps pounding on the ground. The sense of being hunted was crushing. I broke into a run, the flashlight bobbing wildly in my hand. My heart hammered, my lungs burned, and every crack of a branch behind me made me freeze for a split second before sprinting again. After what felt like miles, the trail finally opened onto a dirt road I had seen on the map. Relief washed over me. I followed it quickly, hoping for a way to call for help. But the road was empty and silent. No cars, no houses. Just the thick trees pressing in on both sides. I tried my phone again, still no signal. I felt trapped. The footsteps behind me slowed, then stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stopped running, pressed myself against a tree, and tried to steady my breathing. Minutes passed. I didn't hear anything. Slowly, I peered around the tree. No sign of movement. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, every sense alert, every muscle tense. Finally, after a long, nerve-wracking wait, I gathered the courage to start walking again, slowly this time. The dirt road led me to a small ranger station, deserted but with a light on inside. I knocked on the door until someone came out, a man in his 50s, dressed in a worn jacket and hat. He looked surprised to see me, and after I explained my situation, he radioed for help. Soon, 2 other rangers arrived. They walked the area with me, searching the woods where I had heard the footsteps. They found nothing. They told me that sometimes people get lost or followed by animals, but the feeling of being hunted was often caused by fear itself, making you imagine noises or shapes. I didn't want to believe that, but as dawn broke and the forest lit up with soft morning light, I felt the weight of the night lift a little. I was safe, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been there, waiting in the dark woods, just out of sight. The memory of those heavy breaths and the glowing eyes stayed with me long after I left the forest, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't stories or legends. They're the unknown, the shadows we can't explain, and the quiet moments when we realize we might not be as safe as we think. I remember that day clearly, every detail carved into my mind like it happened yesterday. It started as a normal hiking trip, the kind I had done many times before. I was alone, wanting to clear my head, get away from the noise of everyday life. The forest I chose was dense and old, full of tall pines and thick underbrush, stretching for miles with few paths. It was one of those places that felt untouched, quiet except for the sounds of nature. The sky was clear, and the sun was high, filtering through the leaves and casting moving patches of light on the forest floor. I had planned to hike a trail I hadn't explored before, one I had read about online, but never actually walked. It was supposed to be challenging and remote, and I liked the idea of being completely alone out there. I packed my backpack carefully, water, snacks, a map, compass, flashlight, first aid kit, and a small pocket knife. I also had my phone, though I knew the signal would probably disappear quickly once I was deep in the woods. The first few hours went as expected. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding up and down hills, crossing over roots and small streams. The air smelled fresh, piney, and earthy. I felt calm and focused, enjoying the rhythm of my steps and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Birds flitted in the trees above, and every now and then I caught glimpses of squirrels or rabbits darting away. At some point, the trail became less clear. The markers on trees were sparse, faded, or missing. I paused often, checking my map and compass, trying to stay on course. I knew I should have turned back or retraced my steps, but something pushed me forward. Curiosity, stubbornness, maybe a little overconfidence. The forest seemed thicker here, shadows deeper even though the sun was still out. The sounds of animals had quieted too. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no bird songs. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. About halfway through the afternoon, I realized I had been walking for longer than I planned and hadn't seen any other people. No footprints, no signs of other hikers, no distant voices. I thought maybe the trail ended or got lost, so I checked my compass again. I was supposed to head northwest, but now the path looked more like a narrow animal trail, barely wide enough for one person, twisting in all directions. The trees were thicker, branches tangled, and the ground damp and soft. I stopped to drink some water and eat a snack. The silence was almost overwhelming. My own breathing sounded loud in my ears. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination and that I was fine, but I couldn't deny that something felt off. The forest no longer seemed welcoming. It felt closed in dark, watching. After finishing my snack, I pushed forward, following what looked like the most worn path, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. Minutes passed. I felt a sudden cold rush despite the warm air. I looked around carefully, trying to spot any movement, any sign of life. Nothing. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and twist, but maybe that was just my eyes playing tricks. Then I heard it, a faint crack, like a branch breaking under weight from behind me. I stopped immediately, my heart pounding. I waited, but no more sound. I called out softly to see if it was an animal, but only silence answered. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bird, but the noise had come from the left, not the trail behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but the idea of something following me wasn't comforting. I considered my options. I could try to backtrack, but that could take a while and might make me more lost. I decided to keep moving forward, hoping the path would widen. The forest seemed to close in even more, and the air grew heavier, thick with moisture and the scent of decaying leaves. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, but I still had some light. I increased my pace, pushing through the branches that scraped my arms and legs. I was careful not to trip over roots or loose stones. After about 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing. It was roughly circular, about 20 feet across, surrounded by tall pines. The ground was covered with dry pine needles, and in the center was an old, rotting tree stump. I stopped to catch my breath, and as I looked around, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt. Not animal prints, but human. They were fresh, the edges were sharp, the soil still soft from recent steps. They led from the far edge of the clearing toward the direction I had come from, then disappeared into the underbrush. I stared at them, heart racing. Whoever had walked here recently might still be nearby. I pulled out my flashlight and scanned the edges of the clearing. The forest was growing darker with every passing minute. The footprints didn't lead into the clearing, only out, but I felt a prickling sensation, like eyes watching me from somewhere hidden. Suddenly, I heard the snap of another branch, this time much closer. I whipped around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving between two trees. I froze, listening hard. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I checked my phone. No signal. Battery was dropping fast. I realized I had no way to call for help if something happened. I knew I had to move. Staying still wasn't safe. I turned toward what I hoped was the direction back to the main trail. As I walked, I kept my eyes and ears open. The forest felt alive with unseen presence. Maybe animals, maybe something else. My steps quickened, but I tried not to run because I didn't want to trip or make too much noise. After what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, I stumbled upon an old dirt road. It was wide and clear, with tire tracks and faded paint lines. Relief washed over me. I knew this road connected to the main highway about 2 miles ahead. I started walking along the road, headlamp now turned on, shining down the path. The forest on either side was dark and silent, but the openness of the road made me feel safer. I told myself I just had to keep moving until I reached a place with people. As the minutes passed, I realized I was hearing noises again. Distant barking, the faint sound of engines, maybe voices. I focused on that, quickening my pace. Then, I saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming down the road toward me. I felt a rush of hope. I waved my arms, shining the flashlight. The car slowed and pulled over. A man got out, looked worried, asked if I was okay. I nodded, almost trembling. I told him I was lost in the forest and had been walking for hours. He offered me water, called for a ride, and stayed with me until help arrived. Later, at the hospital, they ran some tests and kept me overnight for observation, but physically I was fine. The doctors said I was dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise okay. That night, I kept thinking about those footprints in the clearing and the shadows I saw. I never found out who or what had been there before me, but I knew that if I hadn't found that road, or if the car hadn't come when it did, things could have ended very differently. The forest wasn't just trees and animals. It held something darker, something that watches and waits. I never went back to that trail, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the silence of those woods, the heavy, watchful quiet that's more frightening than any noise. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the unknown, the feeling of being truly alone in a place that doesn't want you there. And that feeling stays with you, long after you're out and safe. I didn't plan on being out here this late. The sky had been shifting colors all afternoon, the soft blue turning to gray, then darker gray, until it was a deep, heavy black stretched over the trees like a thick blanket. I was supposed to be back at the cabin hours ago, but something about the woods kept pulling me deeper, drawing me in with quiet sounds and the way the wind moved through the branches. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I'd turn around soon, but every step took me farther, and now I could barely see the path behind me. The trees were tall, older than anything I'd seen in my life before. Their trunks were wide, some gnarled with age, their bark rough and cracked. The forest floor was a mess of dead leaves, broken twigs, and moss that felt soft underfoot. As I walked, the air grew cooler, sharper. It smelled of wet earth and pine needles, mixed with the faint, distant scent of smoke, like a campfire far away. I stopped and listened. The only sounds were the wind through the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots, and my own breathing. Nothing else. No animals, no birds, nothing to break the silence. The kind of silence that feels too heavy, like it's waiting for something. I glanced up and saw the sky through the gaps in the canopy. The moon was rising, a pale circle that barely lit anything but the tops of the tallest trees. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing the path ahead and making it impossible to see very far. I wished I'd brought a flashlight, but I had only my phone, and the battery was nearly dead. My heart started to beat faster. I knew I should turn back. I knew I had no good reason to be here, wandering so deep in the woods after dark. But the thought of retracing my steps, of stepping into the dark unknown behind me, made my skin crawl. I had this strange feeling that something was following me. Not just the wind or the trees, but something alive. Something watching. I picked up my pace, trying to find the path again. I thought I heard a branch crack behind me, quick and sharp. I froze, held my breath, waited. Nothing. I told myself it was just a squirrel or a deer, something small, harmless. But the fear was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I wanted to keep moving, to get out of here as fast as possible. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot slipped on a wet patch of moss, and I fell hard onto my side. The cold hit me instantly. I pressed my hands against the dirt, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, my eyes struggled to focus in the dark. The trees seemed closer now, almost closing in on me. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but it was dead. The screen stayed black no matter what I did. Panic welled up inside me. I was alone in a forest with no light, no way to call for help, and no idea how far I'd gone. I forced myself to stand. My ankle ached, but it wasn't broken. The cold seeped into my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I scanned the ground for the path, anything familiar. My heart pounded louder with each step. Then I saw it, something on the ground that didn't belong. It was a shoe, old, muddy, worn at the edges, half buried in the dirt. I knelt down to get a better look. It looked like a hiking boot, but its color was faded and the laces were frayed. The sole was nearly torn off. How had it gotten here? And who did it belong to? A sudden movement caught my eye. Just beyond the boot, I saw something else, a small, dirty piece of fabric tangled in a bush. I pulled it free. It was part of a jacket sleeve, stained and torn. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just a lost shoe. It was a sign. Someone else had been here, and maybe something bad had happened. I forced myself not to think about it. I had to find a way out. I stood up and tried to remember the direction I'd come from. But the forest all looked the same. The same twisted trunks, the same thick underbrush, the same dark shadows. The moonlight wasn't strong enough to guide me. I started walking, hoping to find a trail, a clearing, or any sign of human presence. My ears strained for sounds, a stream, voices, a distant car. But there was nothing, only the wind and the heavy silence. Hours passed. I lost track of time. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my hands trembled from the cold. I kept moving, guided by the faintest hope of finding the cabin or the main road. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder. At one point, I stumbled over a root and fell again. This time, when I looked up, I noticed footprints in the soft mud, large, deep prints, too big to be mine. They led away from the spot where I had fallen, disappearing into the dark woods. I hesitated, but then curiosity overpowered fear. I followed them. The prints were fresh. I could tell because they hadn't been covered by leaves or dirt. They wound through the forest, sometimes close to the path I'd been following, sometimes veering off into thicker brush. After what felt like forever, I reached a small clearing. The moonlight shone brighter here, revealing a rough campsite. A few scattered logs circled a cold fire pit, ashes still smoldering faintly. Empty cans, a half-burned tarp, and more torn clothing lay scattered around. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here recently. Someone who hadn't left peacefully. I looked around, heart hammering. The forest pressed close on all sides, the trees like silent watchers. I realized how exposed I was, how alone. The wind stirred the leaves, making a faint whispering sound, and the shadows flickered like living things. Then I heard it, a soft, low noise from the edge of the clearing, like a breathing sound, slow and heavy. I froze, every muscle tensing. The noise grew louder, closer. I turned slowly toward the sound, barely daring to breathe. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was tall, hunched, moving awkwardly as if injured. Its clothes were torn dirty. Its face was hidden by shadows, but I could see glints of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Fear slammed into me like a physical force. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard. The figure moved toward me, slow and steady. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking, my heart racing. There was nowhere to run, only dense forest in every direction. Then the figure stopped. It didn't move closer. Instead, it just stood there watching me. I looked down and saw blood on its torn shirt, dark and drying. Its hands trembled. Something in me shifted from terror to something else. Pity, maybe, or shock. The figure lowered its head slightly, as if trying to say something without words. I backed away slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. My mind raced. Was this person hurt? Lost? Dangerous? Suddenly, the figure took a step back, disappearing into the shadows again. The breathing faded. The night was silent once more. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran. I ran blindly through the trees, the cold biting at my skin, the rough ground tearing at my shoes. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint glow ahead. It was the cabin, its windows lit warmly against the dark forest. I burst out of the trees, into the clearing around the cabin. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and collapsed against it, shaking. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. I thought about the figure in the woods, the footprints, the scattered campsite. I didn't know who it was or what had happened to them, but I knew I had been lucky. The forest had shown me its dark side that night, something raw and real. Not stories or ghosts, but fear, loneliness, and survival. I stayed inside the cabin until dawn, listening to the soft sounds of the waking world outside. The sun came up slowly, burning away the shadows and bringing light to the woods. I promised myself I would never wander that deep into the forest after dark again, and that I would tell someone somewhere about the figure, about the person who was out there, lost and broken in the night, somewhere beyond the trees. It started as a normal day. I had planned a solo hike in the mountains, somewhere I'd never been before. I needed some time alone, away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of work. The trail was supposed to be an old logging road, barely used these days, winding through thick forest and up toward a ridge with a view of the valley below. I packed a small bag with some essentials: water, a bit of food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a map I'd found online. My phone had barely any signal out there, but I figured that was part of the experience. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The sun was shining bright, casting a golden glow through the tall pines that lined the path. The air smelled fresh, with that sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. I started walking, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots, the steady rhythm of my breath, and the occasional chirping of birds overhead. At first, the trail was easy. It was wide, almost like a dirt road, with scattered patches of grass and wildflowers on the edges. Every so often, I'd come across a fallen tree or a small creek crossing, but nothing challenging. The forest around me was dense, but inviting. Sunlight filtered through the branches, making patterns on the ground. I felt calm, disconnected from everything else. After about 2 hours, the trail started to change. The path narrowed and twisted between large rocks and thick underbrush. The trees grew taller and closer together, casting longer shadows. The sun, which had been warm and comforting earlier, now felt harsher when it peeked through the canopy. I noticed the temperature dropping slightly, a subtle chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. I checked my watch. I was making good time, but I knew the real challenge was ahead. The ridge was about 3 miles from here, and the elevation would get steeper. I kept walking, careful with every step. The ground was uneven, with loose stones and roots that threatened to trip me if I wasn't paying attention. About an hour later, I reached a small clearing near the base of the ridge. The trees opened up here, and I could see patches of sky above me. I stopped to drink some water and eat a granola bar. As I rested, I noticed something odd: faint footprints in the soft soil, leading off the trail and into the woods. They were too small to be from a deer or any large animal. Maybe a dog, I thought, or someone else who had been here recently. I decided to stay on the trail. My gut told me not to follow those prints. I packed up and started the climb up the ridge. The incline was steep, and my legs burned with effort. I stopped frequently to catch my breath, wiping sweat from my forehead. The trees thinned out as I gained height, replaced by bushes and patches of dry grass. Near the top, the wind picked up, cold and sharp. I wrapped my jacket tighter and kept going. Finally, I reached the summit, a rocky outcrop with a breathtaking view of the valley below. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting orange and pink hues over the distant hills. I stood there for a few minutes, soaking in the silence and the beauty. Then I saw it, a figure barely visible, moving slowly along the opposite ridge, about 100 meters away. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a tree stump shaped like a person. But the figure was definitely walking, its silhouette clear against the fading sky. It didn't stop or look around. It just kept moving steadily along the ridge, disappearing slowly into the trees. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Who could be out here so late, and why were they walking like that, so quietly and deliberately? I tried to shake it off. Maybe a hunter or a hiker like me, taking a different trail. I checked the time again. I had about 2 hours of daylight left, which meant I should start heading back soon. I didn't want to be on the ridge after dark, not without proper gear. I turned around and began my descent. The path down was rougher, with loose gravel making my footing tricky. I took it slow, eyes scanning the woods around me. The shadows were lengthening, and the forest seemed to close in tighter. The birds had gone silent, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Halfway down, I heard it, a low, heavy breathing. It came from just off the trail, somewhere behind a clump of bushes. I froze, heart pounding. The sound was close, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shape, just the steady, labored breaths. I stood still, straining to listen. The breathing didn't change or move. It felt like it was watching me, waiting. My mind raced. What could it be? An animal? A person? The forest here was home to bears and mountain lions, but they usually avoided humans. I slowly reached into my backpack and pulled out the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkening woods, shaking slightly in my hands. I scanned the area near the bushes, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that noise. Suddenly, something moved, a shadow darting quickly between the trees. The breathing stopped abruptly. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't know if I should run or stay put. My instincts screamed to get away, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. I started backing away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot where I last saw the movement. The forest felt heavier now, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The silence was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breath. After a few tense moments, I broke into a cautious jog, following the trail down. My eyes darted side to side, searching for any sign of pursuit. The path twisted and turned, and the trees cast long, dark shapes across the ground. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch. As I descended, the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The sky turned a deep blue, then black. My flashlight was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I kept moving, trying to remember the trail from the map and the landmarks I'd seen earlier. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. I froze, panic rising in my chest. I fumbled in my pack for spare batteries, my fingers trembling. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I could hear my breathing, loud and ragged in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I got the flashlight working again. The beam cut through the black, but now the forest looked different, more menacing. The shadows seemed to shift, and the trail was harder to make out. I pressed on, trying to stay calm. Then I heard footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate. They matched my pace, but I didn't dare look back. I increased my speed, heart hammering, desperate to get out of the woods. The trail finally opened up to a small clearing where I had parked my car. Relief flooded me as I saw the headlights shining through the trees. I sprinted toward the car, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove down the dirt road, heart still racing, ears straining for any sound from the forest. When I finally reached the main road, the normal hum of traffic and distant lights felt like a warm blanket, pulling me back to safety. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen and heard. Who was that figure on the ridge? What made that breathing in the woods? I had no answers, only questions that kept me awake. But one thing was clear. Some places in the wild aren't meant to be explored alone, especially when the shadows grow long and the silence starts to whisper. It started with what was supposed to be a simple walk in the evening, something to clear my head after spending most of the day indoors. The air was cool, and the fading light of late afternoon stretched shadows long across the ground. I wasn't far from home, maybe 2 miles at most, but the path I chose was one I didn't usually take. It led through a wooded area that was mostly quiet except for the occasional bird or the rustle of leaves when the wind moved through them. I had been there before during the day, but I had never walked it so late and never alone. The dirt trail was narrow, and the ground was uneven in places where tree roots had grown up through the surface. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude, but there was a strange stillness to the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't the normal quiet of the woods. It was the kind that feels like the whole place is holding its breath. My footsteps sounded too loud against the packed earth, and every time they landed, it seemed like the sound traveled farther than it should have. The deeper I went, the more the light thinned. The sun had dropped lower, and the forest canopy filtered out much of what remained. The path bent and wound between thick trunks, their bark rough and dark, and low branches sometimes reached in close enough to brush against my arms. In the distance, the faint smell of damp soil and decaying leaves grew stronger, the kind of smell you get after a long rain, even though it hadn't rained in days. I noticed the air felt slightly cooler here too, enough to make the skin on my arms prickle. I kept walking, telling myself I'd turn back soon, but then I saw something ahead that made me slow down. About 30 or 40 feet down the trail, just where it curved left, the dirt had been disturbed. It wasn't the kind of unevenness that comes from roots or erosion. It looked like something had dug into it recently. There were shallow furrows and clumps of soil scattered around, and one narrow trench that ran a few feet off the trail into the brush. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, and without thinking, I took a couple of steps closer. The tracks weren't like shoe prints or bike tire marks. They were wide, oddly shaped impressions, deep in some spots and almost invisible in others, like whatever made them had uneven weight or had been dragging something. I knelt down to look more closely, brushing some of the loose dirt aside, and felt the cold, damp ground beneath. The edges of the impressions were sharp, which meant they were recent, probably within the last day. My mind went over what it could be. Maybe a large dog, maybe a deer, though they seemed too deep for that. I stood up and scanned the trees around me. They were packed tight, with patches of undergrowth thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet in. Every now and then a breeze moved through, making the leaves hiss softly, but otherwise it was silent. Too silent. I realized I couldn't hear birds anymore, not even the distant ones, and that gave me a strange knot in my stomach. I decided I'd keep walking just a little farther, and then turn around, mostly because I didn't want to make it seem like I was spooked by nothing. A few minutes later, I started to notice small signs that something had passed through recently. A broken branch here, a patch of flattened grass there. In some spots, leaves were missing entirely from the ground, like they'd been brushed away by movement. I kept moving forward, but my pace slowed without me realizing it. My ears strained to pick up any sound, and my eyes kept flicking between the path ahead and the shadows off to either side. That feeling of being watched crept in. Not sudden, but gradual, the way cold water slowly seeps through clothes until you notice it's everywhere. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint enough that I thought I imagined it, just a soft, steady crunch in the leaves somewhere behind me. It stopped the moment I did. I waited, standing still, the only sound my own breathing. After several seconds, I moved again, slower this time, and there it was, another faint crunch, matching my pace but just out of sync enough to notice. I didn't turn around right away. I just kept going, listening. When it happened again, I glanced back, but the trail was empty. Whatever it was, if it was anything, was keeping just far enough back to stay out of sight. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was probably just an animal moving through the woods. But the thing about wild animals is they don't usually follow you at a steady distance. They either dart away or pass by, but they don't match your pace like they're keeping track of you. That thought sank in heavier than I liked, and I decided to turn back. The idea of continuing deeper didn't feel smart anymore. The moment I turned around, the forest felt different. The same path I'd walked minutes ago now seemed narrower, darker. My steps were quicker now, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but constantly scanning the edges of my vision. I passed the dug-up patch in the dirt again, and something about it felt worse this time, like it was connected to the reason I was uneasy. I didn't stop to look at it. I just kept moving. The sound started again, but now it wasn't behind me. It was off to my left, parallel to the trail. The crunch of leaves, then silence, then the faintest rustle like something brushing past low branches. I could only catch glimpses between the trees, a suggestion of movement, maybe a darker shape against the already dark forest, but never long enough to be certain. My heart rate picked up, and I could feel my chest tightening. I sped up, but so did the movement in the woods, keeping pace without hesitation. Every time I thought I might break into a run, I stopped myself, worried that running might trigger whatever it was to close the distance. I tried to keep my steps even, though my legs felt tight and ready to bolt. The trees seemed to crowd in closer, and the air felt heavier, almost humid despite the cool temperature. My mouth was dry, and my breaths came quicker. The last stretch of the trail was the worst. The woods there were thicker, and the light barely made it through. I could see the faint opening ahead where the trail met the road, but it felt impossibly far away. The sound to my left moved closer, and for the first time, I heard something else. Short, sharp breaths, like someone trying to stay quiet, but unable to control their breathing completely. They weren't animal sounds. They were human. That realization hit me hard enough that my control broke. I started running, my shoes pounding against the dirt, every step feeling slower than it should have. Branches whipped at my arms and legs, and the undergrowth on my left erupted with movement. Whatever had been tracking me breaking into a run too. I didn't look to see it. I didn't want to know how close it was. I burst out of the tree line onto the gravel shoulder of the road, my shoes slipping on the loose stones before I caught my balance. The movement in the woods stopped instantly, as if whatever was there had no intention of stepping into the open. I turned then, chest heaving, and scanned the tree line. There was nothing, no shape, no sound, just the stillness of the forest. I didn't wait. I walked quickly along the road back toward my house, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The whole time, I could feel that same sensation, like eyes on me from somewhere just out of sight. Even when I reached my street, it didn't fade completely. When I finally got inside, locking the door behind me, my hands were trembling hard enough that I had to lean against the wall for a moment. Later, when I thought about it, the worst part wasn't the sound or even the breathing. It was the way it matched me the whole time, never rushing until I did, never letting me see it. It knew exactly how to stay hidden, exactly how close to come without crossing the line into the open. And that meant it wasn't random. Whatever it was, it chose me the second I stepped onto that trail, and it wanted me to know it was there. It started in the late afternoon, when the sun was hanging low and the shadows in the valley began to stretch across the dirt road. I had been driving for hours, my eyes burning from staring at the endless stretch of uneven asphalt, with nothing but brown hills and patches of dead grass on either side. The road was narrow, cracked in places, with weeds pushing up through the tar. Every few minutes I'd pass a bent road sign or a half-collapsed fence, and it gave the place a feeling that no one really came out here anymore. I was heading toward a small cabin I had borrowed from a friend. They'd said it was peaceful and perfect for clearing your head. But by the time I turned off the main road onto a gravel track that seemed barely wide enough for my car, I wasn't thinking about peace. The air felt heavier here, like the silence itself had weight. My tires crunched over the gravel, dust lifting behind me in a long trail that just hung in the air without wind to carry it away. The trees began to close in the deeper I went, tall pines mixed with a few twisted oaks, their branches bending low enough to brush against the roof of the car. The sun kept dipping, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sky was more orange than blue. The cabin itself looked older than I had imagined. Its wooden planks were weathered and gray, with the kind of texture that comes from years of rain and sun beating against it. There was a small porch with a single step, the railing half-rotted and leaning to one side. The windows were dusty, the glass slightly warped, making the reflections bend and shift when I moved. I parked the car a little way from the cabin and hauled my bag up the step. Inside, it was small but not unpleasant, just a single room with a small bed against the back wall, a wood-burning stove, and a table with two mismatched chairs. There was a faint smell of old smoke and pine, like someone had left a fire burning a few days ago. I set my bag on the bed and walked to the back window. Beyond it, the forest thickened quickly. The ground was covered in a layer of dead needles and leaves, and I couldn't see more than 50 feet before the trees blurred into shadow. The plan had been simple: spend a night here, get some rest, maybe do a short hike in the morning before heading back. I had brought some food, a flashlight, and a few basic supplies. Nothing about this felt dangerous, just isolated. Still, I made sure to lock the door once I went back outside to fetch some firewood stacked against the wall. The air was cooler now. The sound of the forest at this hour was almost too quiet. No wind, no birdsong, just the faint creak of branches settling. I grabbed a few logs and brought them inside. By the time I had a small fire going in the stove, the light outside was fading fast. It was during that slow shift from evening to night that I first noticed it. At first it was just a faint sound, like a footstep on gravel. It came from outside, toward the side of the cabin where the porch wrapped around. I froze, listening, but when it didn't repeat right away, I told myself it might have been something falling from a tree. I tried to shake it off, but then it came again, 2, maybe 3 slow crunching steps. My first thought was animal, maybe a deer, maybe something smaller. But the pace was too deliberate, spaced too far apart, like someone trying to move quietly, but not quite managing it. I went to the window near the table and peered out, but the porch was empty. The darkness beyond the reach of the fire's light was deep, and anything could have been standing just past it without me seeing. The steps stopped after a moment, and I tried to return to what I was doing, though I found myself glancing at the door more often than not. When the fire had burned down enough, I decided to get ready for bed. The old mattress creaked under my weight, and I lay staring at the ceiling for a long time before finally drifting off. I woke up to a noise that was different from before. This was closer, heavier, like the creak of wood under pressure. It took a few seconds for me to realize it was the porch boards bending under someone's weight. My heart started pounding instantly, the kind of sharp, deep thud that fills your ears. I didn't move at first, just lay there listening. The sound was slow. One board creaked, then silence, then another. Whoever it was moving carefully, as if trying not to be noticed. Then came the faintest scrape against the wall, right outside the window near my bed. I rolled as quietly as I could to the other side of the mattress, pulling the blanket up as though it would do anything. My eyes flicked toward the window, but the angle kept me from seeing much. The scrape came again, higher this time, like fingertips brushing against the wood. I stayed still for what felt like a long time. Eventually, the sound stopped. I told myself they'd left, but my body stayed tense, every muscle wired to listen. At some point I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the window. I got up and stepped outside. The air was damp, the ground soft from dew. I walked to the side of the cabin and saw it immediately. On the wall, about chest height, were 3 long streaks in the dust on the wood. They weren't claw marks. They were clean lines where the dirt had been brushed away, like from the pads of fingers. I told myself it could have been anything, branches, maybe, but branches didn't leave lines like that. The rest of the day I stayed close to the cabin, uneasy but not ready to leave yet. I forced myself to walk a little way into the trees, collecting more firewood. The deeper I went, the darker it felt. The ground here was uneven, small mounds and dips hidden under leaves, and I had to watch my step. I stopped once when I thought I heard something behind me, just a faint shift of weight on the forest floor, but when I turned, nothing moved. By late afternoon, the shadows started to grow again. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the edge of the forest. That's when I saw it. A shape, standing just inside the tree line, not moving. It was too far to see clearly, but it wasn't an animal. The outline was wrong, tall, narrow still. My mouth went dry instantly. I stared at it for what must have been minutes, trying to see if it was a trick of the light. Then slowly, it turned and stepped back into the trees. That night was worse than the first. I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I kept the flashlight close, the fire in the stove going strong, listening for anything. Around midnight, I heard movement again, this time circling the cabin. Gravel crunching, boards creaking, then silence, then movement again from another side. I stayed sitting in the chair by the stove, barely breathing, until the sounds faded into the distance. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I packed quickly, checking the windows every few seconds. The forest was quiet again, but the kind of quiet that felt like something watching. I loaded my bag into the car, started the engine, and didn't look back until I hit the main road. Even then, in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure standing far down the gravel track, half hidden by the trees. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just drove until the cabin, the forest, and whatever had been moving around me were miles behind. But even now, when I think about that place, I can still hear the slow, careful steps on the porch in the dark, and the scrape of fingers against the wall just inches from where I had been lying. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to go for a drive outside of town. The day had been overcast since morning, the sky a dull sheet of gray that pressed down over everything. The air was heavy and still, almost too still, like the world had been paused. I didn't have anywhere to be and no real reason for the drive, but the quiet in my apartment had been making me restless. I wanted to get away from the sound of the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I wanted to see something different, even if it was just the empty countryside. I drove out past the edges of the city until the houses thinned out into scattered farms. The road wound between long, flat fields of dry grass and skeletal trees. There were no sidewalks here, no streetlights, just two narrow lanes of cracked asphalt cutting through land that looked abandoned. Every so often I would pass a weathered mailbox leaning at an angle, or an old barn with its roof sagging in the middle. The light was fading faster than I had expected, and the horizon was already taking on that dim, bluish tone that comes right before night. I thought about turning around, but the road kept pulling me forward. After another 15 minutes, the pavement turned into gravel without warning. The sound under my tires changed, the car rumbling and crunching over the uneven surface. Dust rose in the rearview mirror, hanging in the still air like smoke. I slowed down, scanning for a place to turn around, but the road was narrow, lined with overgrown ditches. The trees had closed in tighter now, tall and bare, their branches tangled together overhead like dark veins against the pale sky. I kept driving, thinking maybe there would be a wider spot ahead. That's when I saw the truck. It was an old, dark pickup parked on the right side of the road, facing my direction. The hood was dull with rust, and one of the headlights was cracked. There was no one in sight, and the driver's door hung half open. At first, I thought maybe it had broken down, but the way it was sitting there, just slightly crooked, gave me a strange feeling I couldn't place. I slowed down even more, my hands tightening on the wheel, eyes scanning the trees on both sides. No movement, no sound except the low hum of my engine. I passed it slowly, glancing into the cab as I went by. The seats were torn, and there was a dirty blanket thrown across the passenger side. On the floor, something metallic caught the light, maybe a wrench or a crowbar. The rearview mirror was missing. I didn't see any keys in the ignition. My stomach felt tight, and I pressed down on the accelerator, wanting to put distance between me and that truck. The road ahead curved slightly, and the trees seemed to press in closer. The light was fading so quickly now that it was hard to tell where the branches ended and the shadows began. I glanced in my rearview mirror out of habit. That's when my heart gave a hard, painful thud. The truck's headlights had come on. I gripped the wheel, eyes darting between the mirror and the road ahead. The truck wasn't moving yet, but the beams were bright and steady, cutting through the dimness. I told myself maybe someone had just come back. Maybe they'd been in the woods and were about to drive off. But then the headlights shifted slightly, like the front wheels had turned toward the road. I pressed the gas a little more, not wanting to floor it, and looked like I was panicking. The gravel rattled under the tires, and my car swayed slightly on the uneven road. In the mirror, the truck was moving now, slow at first, then picking up speed. I could see the dust rising behind it. The road was still narrow, and the ditches on either side looked deep enough to wreck my car if I swerved off. The trees were like walls now, blocking out any view of the sky except for a thin strip above. My chest felt tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept my eyes forward, scanning for any sign of a turn or an intersection. Nothing. Just more road twisting ahead into the deepening shadows. The truck was closer now, maybe 100 feet back, its engine a low, steady growl beneath the sound of my tires. My mouth had gone dry, and I could feel sweat gathering at the base of my neck. Every instinct was telling me not to stop, not even to slow down. I thought about calling someone, but my phone was in the passenger seat, and I didn't dare take my eyes off the road long enough to grab it. The first sharp turn came up fast. I took it too quickly, the tires spitting gravel, and the back of the car fishtailed before I corrected it. In the mirror, The truck took the corner just as fast, its headlights swinging wildly across the trees before locking back on me. I pushed the accelerator harder, the engine straining. The speedometer needle crept higher, but the road seemed to go on endlessly, twisting and bending, never giving me a straight stretch where I could really open it up. Then I saw the dead deer. It was lying on its side in the middle of the road, its legs stiff, eyes clouded over. I had just enough time to swerve around it, the edge of my right tire dipping into the gravel shoulder. The truck behind me swerved too, missing it by inches. The sight of it made my stomach turn, not just because it was dead, but because it looked fresh, no signs of decay, no scavenger marks. Like it hadn't been there long at all. The trees began to thin slightly, and up ahead I saw what looked like an old dirt driveway breaking off to the right. It was narrow and half hidden by weeds, but it was the first chance I'd had to get off this road. Without thinking, I cut the wheel hard and turned into it, the car bouncing over ruts and rocks. Branches scraped along both sides, and the ground was uneven, making the suspension groan. I drove until the driveway curved sharply around a cluster of thick trees, and I pulled off to the side, cutting the engine. My hands shook as I killed the headlights. The sudden silence felt deafening after the constant roar of tires and wind. I sat there, gripping the wheel, eyes fixed on the narrow strip of driveway I could see through the trees. The sound of the truck's engine grew louder again, then passed by without slowing. The glow of its headlights swept across the woods for a moment, then faded. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting. A minute passed. Then two. The woods were so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just heavy, unmoving silence. After what felt like forever, I started the car again, keeping the headlights off. I eased back toward the road, stopping just short of the edge. There was no sign of the truck in either direction. I turned left, heading back the way I'd come. Every bump in the gravel felt sharper now, every shadow darker. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and I didn't look in the mirror more than once. When I finally saw the lights of the city ahead, my chest loosened for the first time in what felt like hours. When I got home, I sat in the car with the engine off, staring at the faint reflection of my face in the windshield. My hands still felt unsteady. I kept thinking about that truck, sitting there on the side of the road with its door open, and how quickly it had started after I passed. Whoever was inside hadn't been broken down. They'd been waiting, and I'd almost found out for what. It started with a simple plan that I thought would be uneventful. I wanted to get away for a few days and clear my head, so I drove out to a small, isolated cabin I'd rented in the hills. It was tucked into the woods, far from town, reached by a winding dirt road that had no streetlights and no houses along the way. I arrived in the late afternoon, just before the sun started sinking behind the tree-line. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant creak of tree branches swaying in the breeze. The cabin was small but well-kept, with a porch that overlooked a narrow clearing. Beyond the clearing, dense woods stretched for miles, the kind of forest where you could get lost within minutes if you weren't careful. I unpacked my bags inside, noting the way the old floorboards groaned under my weight. There was no phone signal here. The place was lit by a couple of small lamps that gave off a warm, yellow light, and in the corner of the room was a wood stove for heating. After unloading my stuff, I stepped back outside. The air felt colder now, the sun barely visible between the tops of the trees. The shadows grew longer, stretching like dark fingers across the ground. I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked into the forest. It was quiet, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no chirping insects, just the sound of my own breathing. I stood there for a while, feeling a faint unease I couldn't quite explain. Eventually, I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to the silence. That night, after making a quick dinner, I sat out on the porch with a mug of coffee. The light from inside spilled across the porch floorboards, but beyond that, the darkness was thick. I could barely see past the first line of trees. Every now and then, I thought I heard something out there, a faint crunch of leaves, a shift in the underbrush, but it would stop as soon as I focused on it. I stayed out there for maybe 20 minutes before the cold and the quiet began to feel oppressive, and I went back inside. The cabin had a single bedroom, small and simple. I got into bed early, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I left one of the lamps on in the main room. I've never liked complete darkness. For a while, I just lay there listening. The woods outside were silent, but the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's hiding something. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy and I drifted off. Some time later, I woke to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. The steps were slow, deliberate, spaced far enough apart that it didn't sound like a deer or anything small. I lay still, my ears straining. It circled the cabin, the sound of weight shifting over dead leaves and twigs. My heartbeat picked up. I stayed quiet, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. There was no knock, no voice, just stillness. I waited for what felt like minutes. Then came the sound of wood creaking under weight. Something was on the porch. I got out of bed slowly and moved toward the main room. The lamp was still on, its soft glow casting weak light toward the door. My shadow stretched across the floor. I glanced at the window but couldn't see anything outside. It was just black. The porch creaked again, this time closer to the door. I stood completely still, breathing as quietly as I could. After another long pause, the sound faded, replaced by the crunch of leaves again, moving away from the cabin and into the woods. I stayed frozen for a while longer before finally returning to bed, though sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to check for tracks. The ground was littered with pine needles and leaves, but there were spots where the debris had been disturbed, leading from the edge of the clearing to the porch and then back toward the forest. The impressions looked too large and spaced out for a small animal. I told myself it could have been a black bear or maybe a stray dog, though deep down I didn't believe it. I tried to shake off the unease, but it stayed with me throughout the day. I went for a walk along the dirt road, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Every so often, I'd think I saw something between the trees, a quick flicker of movement, a shape, but it was always gone before I could focus. When I returned to the cabin, the light was already dimming. That night, I made sure the door was locked, the windows shut tight. I ate quickly and stayed inside, reading a book just to distract myself. The silence outside pressed against the walls, and I kept glancing toward the window, expecting to see something standing there. It was just after midnight when I heard the noise again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a faint scraping sound, like something dragging across wood. It came from the back of the cabin. I froze, my eyes fixed on the rear wall. The sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I strained to hear anything else, but there was only silence. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the main room with the light on, waiting for something to happen, but nothing else came. The following morning, I walked around the cabin. Near the back, I found a section of the wall where the wood was marked with long, shallow scratches. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. The lighter wood underneath showed through clearly. The logical part of my mind told me it was probably an animal, but the scratches were high, higher than a raccoon or fox could reach without climbing. The rest of that day passed quietly, but the sense of being watched never left. Anytime I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me from somewhere in the trees. The wind was still, the air cold and unmoving, and the woods seemed to hold their breath. On the third night, I was in bed when I woke to the unmistakable sound of the porch creaking again. My heart began to pound instantly. The steps were slow, deliberate, heavier than before. They moved right up to the door, and then there was a pause. The silence stretched out until I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then came a soft but distinct sound, the slow turn of the door handle. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tense. The handle stopped, and for several seconds there was nothing. Then the footsteps retreated, the porch groaned again, and the sound of movement faded into the woods. At dawn, I packed my bags. I didn't take time for breakfast or even coffee. I loaded everything into the car, keeping my eyes on the tree line. The forest was quiet as ever, and nothing moved. I drove away down the dirt road, my hands tight on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the cabin disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by the forest. It's been weeks since then, but the memory of that silence, those careful, deliberate steps, still comes back at night. I don't know who or what was out there. All I know is that if I had stayed one more night, I might have found out. And I don't think I would have liked the answer. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just a short detour off the highway to stretch my legs before continuing the long drive home. I had been on the road for hours, and my eyes were heavy from staring at the same endless strip of asphalt. The air outside was cool, the kind of early evening chill that settles in as the sun starts dipping low. I pulled over at a small gravel turnout on the side of a quiet country road, far from any town. There was no traffic, no lights, just the thin gray strip of road cutting through fields and patches of woods. The moment I stepped out, the silence struck me. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you might hear in a park or a backyard. It was deeper, heavier. There were no distant cars, no voices, not even the sound of wind in the trees. Just stillness. I could hear my own breathing, every step of my shoes crunching on gravel. Off to my left was a narrow dirt path disappearing into a stand of tall, thin trees. It looked like a trail, maybe used by locals to cut through to a field or a creek. I didn't plan on going far, just enough to walk off the stiffness in my legs. The trail was uneven, littered with small rocks and patches of dry leaves that crackled under my steps. The air felt slightly damp as I moved further in. The light from the road faded quickly, swallowed up by the shadow of the trees. Every few steps, I could hear twigs snapping somewhere in the distance, but I told myself it was probably squirrels or a rabbit. The path wound in a slow curve, and soon the road was no longer visible. I glanced back a couple of times, half expecting to see the gleam of my car, but it was gone from sight. The deeper I went, the more the quiet seemed to change. It wasn't just the absence of noise anymore. It felt like something was pressing in around me, like the air itself was heavier. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, and each one seemed to echo longer than it should have. The smell of damp earth and old leaves was strong, but there was something else mixed in, something faint but unpleasant, a sharp, almost metallic scent I couldn't place. I told myself I'd just go a few more steps before turning back, but that was when I noticed something odd about the ground. There were prints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were just boot tracks, but they were larger than any boot I'd seen, and the stride was too long. The impressions were deep, as if whoever made them had been heavy or carrying something. They led further down the path, disappearing into a darker section where the trees grew closer together. For some reason, I followed them. I can't explain why. Maybe I was just curious. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to thicken. I could hear my own heartbeat, quick and steady. The path narrowed, the undergrowth on either side pushing in closer. I felt the branches snag against my jacket as I walked. Then I heard it, faint at first, but clear enough to stop me in my tracks. It was a slow, heavy breathing. It didn't sound close, but it was there, somewhere ahead of me. The rhythm of it was strange, drawn-out inhales followed by shorter, almost impatient exhales. I stood completely still, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to drift through the trees. I could feel the hair on my arms rise, the way it does when something inside you says to turn around. My throat felt dry. I listened for a long moment, then started to back up, slow and careful. But the breathing changed. It became quieter, further away, almost as if it was moving off to my right. I took a few steps back, keeping my eyes on the dark section of the trail ahead. Then I caught movement, not a full shape, just a shift in the shadows between the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow. I don't know why I didn't run right then. Maybe I was afraid that if I did, whatever it was would give chase. My legs felt tense, ready to move but locked in place. The breathing faded, but I could still sense movement deeper in the woods, just beyond where I could see clearly. My stomach tightened as I realized that I was too far in now. I couldn't see the road, and I didn't know if the way back was as clear as I thought. I started walking quickly, forcing myself not to look back. My boots crunched on the dirt and leaves, each sound feeling too loud. The trail was harder to follow going back. The trees all looked the same, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I was going the right way. That's when I heard the breathing again, closer now, behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see. My pace quickened into a near jog, my hands clenching into fists without me realizing. The sound followed, steady, unhurried, as if whatever it was knew it didn't need to rush. My chest was tight, my breaths coming faster. Every step felt like it took longer to land. I finally caught sight of the thin line of the road through the trees ahead. Relief hit me, but it was laced with panic. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my arms and face. The breathing behind me seemed louder, but I didn't dare glance back. My boots hit the gravel, and I sprinted to my car, fumbling for the keys with shaking hands. When I yanked the door open, I finally looked toward the trail. There was nothing there, just the dark mouth of the path, still and empty. I slid into the seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. The moment my headlights lit the road ahead, I pulled away fast, the gravel scattering under my tires. Even as the trees thinned and the road opened up to empty fields, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something stepping out of the woods. But the road stayed empty, the night swallowing everything behind me. I drove for nearly an hour before I started to feel like my breathing had gone back to normal. But the smell was still there, the faint metallic tang I'd noticed in the woods. I realized then it wasn't coming from the air. It was on me. My jacket smelled like it. And I couldn't stop thinking about those prints in the dirt, too large for a man, too deep for someone walking without a load. I never took that road again. Even now, when I think about it, the part that unsettles me the most isn't the breathing, or the movement I saw, or even the smell. It's the fact that whatever it was never hurried. It didn't need to. It knew exactly where I was, and it knew I was leaving. I still remember how everything felt that day. The way the air seemed heavier than usual, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. It started as a simple hike, just me and my camera, eager to get some quiet time and maybe capture a few good shots in the forest near my town. I'd been there plenty of times, knew the trails well, or so I thought. The morning was cool but clear. The sun was just rising, throwing soft golden light between the trees, and the dew was still clinging to the leaves and grass. I took my usual path, an old dirt trail that curved gently through thick pine and birch, the kind of place where the smell of wet earth and moss sinks deep into your lungs. Birds were singing quietly, nothing out of the ordinary. I stopped often, crouching or kneeling to focus my lens on a spider's web heavy with tiny drops of water or the delicate patterns on a fallen leaf. Everything felt calm and normal. I had my backpack with me, full of water, snacks, and extra lenses. I was alone, but I liked it that way. No distractions, no noise, just me and the forest. After an hour or so, I came to a fork in the trail that I hadn't explored before. I remembered it being there, but the last time I was in this area, I had stuck to the main path. This side trail looked narrow, covered with fallen leaves and twigs, barely visible in some parts, as if nature was trying to erase it. I figured it might lead to a clearing or some interesting spot I hadn't seen yet. So, I decided to take it. The forest around me changed slowly as I walked. The trees grew taller and closer, their trunks thick and dark, the canopy above blocking out more sunlight. The air felt cooler and damper. The ground was softer, covered in a thick bed of pine needles and moss. I kept my camera ready, hoping for something worth capturing, but so far, there was nothing unusual. About 30 minutes in, the path suddenly ended at a small hill, and at the top, I spotted an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, its wood faded and cracked, the roof sagging. The windows were broken or missing, and vines were creeping up the sides. My heart started to beat a little faster. I had never noticed this cabin before, and it was strange to find it here, so deep in the woods. I took a few steps closer, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. The air around the cabin was different, colder, heavier. It felt like the forest had shifted, like the quiet was too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and breathing. I raised my camera to take a picture of the cabin, but the viewfinder seemed blurry, as if the lens was fogged up. I wiped it with my sleeve and tried again, but the same thing happened. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to move around the cabin, looking for an entrance. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me, a sharp, musty odor mixed with decay and damp wood. The floorboards groaned under my feet, and dust floated in the slivers of light coming through the broken windows. The cabin was small, just one room, empty except for a few broken chairs and what looked like an old stove in the corner. There were no signs of recent use, but something felt off. I moved to the back wall, where a narrow doorway led to a tiny room, maybe a storage closet or cellar. I shined my flashlight in, but the beam was swallowed by darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape move just inside, but when I blinked, it was gone. My heart thudded hard. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or a rat scurrying away. I didn't want to be here any longer. I grabbed my bag and headed out the door, deciding to take a different path back to the main trail. As I walked away from the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees loomed like silent giants, their branches reaching out like fingers. The sunlight dimmed, filtered through thick clouds that had rolled in without me noticing. A cold wind stirred the leaves, whispering in a way that sounded almost like voices. I shook my head, trying to focus on the trail, but I realized I didn't recognize it anymore. The path was gone, swallowed up by fallen branches and thick underbrush. I tried to turn back the way I came, but everything looked the same. Tall trees, dark shadows, the same silence pressing in on me. Panic started to rise. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was still good, but the map app couldn't locate me. I was lost. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. I had water and snacks. I would find my way back. I started walking, trying to mark my path with small piles of stones and broken twigs. The forest grew darker as the sun slipped behind the clouds. Shadows lengthened, and the wind picked up, carrying a cold, damp chill. After what felt like hours, I found a stream. The sound of running water was a relief. I knelt down, drank some water, and refilled my bottle. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to a road or a clearing. As night fell, the forest became a different place. The sounds of insects and animals changed, more urgent, almost like a warning. I set up a small camp near the stream, building a fire with wet wood that smoked more than it burned. The fire gave me some comfort, but the feeling of being watched never left. The wind howled through the trees, making them creak and sway. Shadows danced at the edges of my firelight. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to rest, but couldn't stop scanning the dark woods around me. Sometime during the night, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy, slow, too big to be any animal I knew. I froze, heart pounding, but the sound stopped quickly. I stayed awake, clutching a stick, ready for anything. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Morning light was a blessing. I packed up my meager camp and kept following the stream. I walked for hours, my legs aching, stomach growling, mind exhausted. Then I heard voices, distant, muffled, but real. I pushed through the undergrowth and found a dirt road. A small group of hikers were coming down the trail. I waved frantically and called out until they saw me. They gave me water and food and helped me call for help. Later, the rescue team found my car parked near the trailhead. I was safe. The whole experience stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly things can change and how easy it is to lose your way. The forest is beautiful but unforgiving, and it never forgets. Even now, when I go back to those woods, I avoid that old cabin and that hidden trail. I keep to the familiar paths and always tell someone where I'm going. Because sometimes, getting lost isn't just about losing your way on a map. It's about losing your sense of safety, and that can take a long time to find again. I woke up to the soft glow of dawn slipping through the thin curtains of the small cabin. The air was still cool, carrying the faint smell of pine and wet earth that clung to the woods outside. I had arrived the day before, alone, hoping to find some peace away from the noise of the city and the buzz of everyday life. The forest stretched all around me, thick with towering firs and twisted oaks, the ground blanketed in a soft layer of moss and fallen leaves. It felt calm, quiet in a way that was almost unnatural, like the woods were holding their breath. I decided to start the day with a walk, needing to stretch my legs and explore the trails I'd heard about from the old man at the ranger station. The trailhead was just a short walk from the cabin, marked by a weathered wooden sign half swallowed by ivy. The path was narrow, winding between trees so close their branches tangled overhead, casting long shadows even in the growing light. The forest floor was uneven, the roots snaking across the trail like sleeping snakes waiting to trip the unwary. I moved carefully, boots crunching softly on the scattered needles and twigs. As I walked, I tried to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the kind of watching that happens in a busy street or at a crowded bar. This was something else, a silent, patient observation that seemed to come from the woods themselves. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me glance over my shoulder. But each time, there was nothing, just trees, still and silent. After a couple of hours, the trail began to climb. The trees grew thinner, and patches of sunlight broke through the canopy, warming the damp soil. The air smelled fresher here, mixed with the sharp scent of wildflowers and the faint, distant smell of smoke from a fire someone had built days ago. I paused on a large rock to catch my breath and drink some water from my bottle. Looking around, I could see the tops of the hills rolling out in every direction, the forest stretching far beyond where my eyes could reach. I started to head back, but then I noticed something odd on the ground. A series of footprints pressed into the soft earth, leading off the trail and into the thicker brush. They were large, with deep impressions and oddly spaced, as if the creature that made them had a long stride. The prints didn't match anything I knew from animals or even humans. I followed them out of curiosity, the branches scraping at my jacket as I pushed deeper into the undergrowth. The footprints led me to a small clearing surrounded by trees, so close together their trunks formed a kind of wall. In the middle was a shallow pit, maybe a meter across, filled with broken branches and leaves, as if something had tried to make a nest or hide something there. I felt a strange chill run through me as I looked into the pit. The soil around it was disturbed, fresh, and there were bits of dark red stains on the rocks nearby. My heart started to beat faster, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But something held me there. I knelt down and reached out to touch the soil. It was soft and warm. Then, the sharp snap of a branch nearby made me jump to my feet, spinning around. The forest was quiet again. No movement. No sound other than the wind whispering through the leaves. I took a few steps back toward the trail, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal that had made the prints and the nest. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever had been here was bigger, stronger, and not quite right. As the afternoon wore on, the sky started to darken with thick clouds rolling in fast. I checked my watch and realized I had been gone longer than I planned. I hurried back down the trail, the woods feeling heavier around me, the shadows lengthening and thickening until it seemed the trees were closing in. When I reached the cabin, the door was slightly ajar, swinging slowly in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked it when I left. Inside, everything was the same except the small wooden box I had kept on the table was missing. It held my notebook and some photos, things I hadn't wanted to lose. Panic twisted in my chest. Had someone followed me here? Was I being watched? I locked the door again, pushed a chair against it, and tried to settle down for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Outside, the rain began to fall in heavy sheets, pounding on the roof and windows. The forest seemed alive with sound, the steady drumming of rain, the groan of the wind, the distant call of an animal I couldn't identify. Every noise made me jump. Hours passed, and the storm intensified. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the trees in sharp, white flashes. Thunder rolled over the hills, shaking the cabin. I stayed close to the window, watching the rain blur the world outside, my mind racing. Then, just after midnight, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow circle of light in the blackness. As I moved toward the door to check the locks again, I heard it, a soft scratching sound at the window. Frozen, I held my breath and shone the light toward the noise. Nothing but rain-streaked glass. The scratching came again, louder this time, like nails scraping wood. My pulse slammed in my ears as I backed away from the window. The sound moved around the cabin, circling, scratching, sometimes pausing, then starting again. I wanted to call for help, but the phone had no signal. My only hope was to wait for daylight. Hours passed with the scratching continuing, until finally, just before dawn, it stopped. The rain eased, and the forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed my things and left the cabin behind. On the way back down the trail, I looked again for the footprints but found only the rain-washed earth, smooth and untouched. When I reached the ranger station, I told them about the footprints and the noises. They looked at me like I was crazy, but said sometimes bears or large animals wander close to cabins during storms, drawn by the smell of food. But the footprints I described were nothing like a bear's, and the scratching around the cabin didn't match any animal behavior I'd heard of. I never went back to that part of the woods. The memory stayed with me, a quiet reminder that some places hold secrets you don't want to find. Even now, when the wind howls outside or the rain taps at my window, I think about those footprints and the scratching, and I wonder what was really watching me from the shadows, waiting for the storm to hide it. It was early evening when I decided to take a walk down a stretch of road I hadn't been on in a long time. The sun was already low, the sky still holding on to the last bits of daylight, but the air felt heavier than usual. The place was far from town, the the kind of road where you could walk for a mile and not see another person. On one side was a row of tall, untrimmed hedges, and behind them a thick, dark tree line. On the other side was a wide, empty field with patches of wild grass swaying in the slight wind. The road itself was cracked, with weeds pushing through in spots, and the faint sound of insects buzzed from all directions. I wasn't carrying anything with me, no bag, no water, just my phone in my pocket. At first, it felt calm. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have, each one echoing a little in the stillness. I could hear the crunch of small stones under my shoes and the faint hiss of the breeze moving across the grass. Every few seconds, a bird hidden somewhere in the hedge would rustle and shift. The air smelled faintly of earth and something damp, like the ground had been wet earlier in the day. I had no plan, no set point to reach, just walking for the sake of it, letting my mind wander. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something odd. Up ahead, maybe 100 yards, a man was walking in the same direction as me. I hadn't seen him before, and he hadn't passed me, so I figured he must have come out from a side path or from the trees. He was moving at a steady pace, not too fast, but I could tell from the way his arms swung that his stride was longer than mine. He wore dark clothing that made it hard to make out details from this distance. I didn't think much of it at first, just another person walking. But then I realized there weren't any houses or paths in the direction we were both heading. The road dead-ended about 2 miles ahead into a small overgrown lot, beyond which was nothing but thick forest. It wasn't a place you'd go unless you had a reason. I slowed my pace slightly, just enough so I wouldn't be closing the gap between us. For a moment I thought about turning around, but I told myself it was unnecessary. People could walk here for all kinds of reasons. A few more minutes passed, and the light was fading faster now. The sky had shifted from pale gold to a dim blue-gray, and the air had cooled enough that I could feel goosebumps on my arms. I noticed the man's pace had slowed too, almost matching mine, as if he was making sure I stayed behind him. It was subtle, but each time I slowed, he seemed to as well. My stomach tightened slightly. I decided to cross to the other side of the road, partly to get a clearer view and partly to put a little more space between us. The asphalt was uneven, and I had to watch my footing. When I looked up again, the man had turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the outline of his jaw in the dim light. He didn't look back for long, but long enough for me to feel that strange, cold awareness you get when you know you've been noticed. We kept walking. The hedges to my left grew thicker, the tree line behind them almost black now. The insects were louder, their high-pitched drone filling the air, so much it was hard to hear anything else. The man ahead of me shifted his shoulders, as if adjusting the way he carried himself. I began to notice small details, how his right arm didn't swing as freely as the left, how his head tilted slightly forward, how his steps were deliberate but not hurried. At this point, my thoughts were turning over slowly but steadily. If I turned around now, it would be obvious. He might see it as a signal. But if I kept going, I'd be heading deeper into a stretch of road with no exits and no houses. I glanced back, hoping maybe another person had come along, but the road behind me was empty all the way to the curve. A little further ahead, the road narrowed where the hedge grew closer to the field. That section always made me uneasy even in the daytime, because the visibility dropped to almost nothing. I knew once we passed through it, there'd be an even darker stretch where the trees hung directly over the road. My mind kept telling me to stop walking, but my legs carried me forward anyway. I noticed something else. Every time I let my eyes wander to the side for more than a few seconds, the man's head would shift slightly, like he was checking to see if I was still there. It wasn't a full turn, just a small movement, but enough to make me certain he was aware of me the entire time. As we reached the narrow stretch, the sounds around us seemed to muffle. The breeze died down, and the buzzing of insects seemed more distant, replaced by the quiet scrape of our shoes on the rough surface. My breathing felt louder in my own ears, and I tried to keep it steady. Halfway through the shaded section, the man did something that made my chest tighten. He slowed just slightly, enough that I began to close the distance without meaning to. Then he shifted to the far side of the road, almost as if making space for me to pass. I didn't want to pass him. Something about the idea of being ahead of him on this empty road felt worse than staying behind. I slowed too, matching his new pace. The next thing I noticed was the way his right hand moved. It had been hanging loosely before, but now his fingers flexed every few seconds, like he was testing them. I couldn't see anything in his hand, but the thought that there could be something small, something he could hide easily, made my throat go dry. When the road opened up again, I expected him to keep going straight toward the dead end. Instead, he stepped off to the side where a narrow, barely visible dirt path cut into the trees. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just walked into the shadows and disappeared between the trunks. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, watching the spot where he had vanished. The path was so overgrown it barely looked like a trail. I strained my ears, trying to hear his footsteps, but the sound was swallowed up by the thick wall of forest noise. I realized I didn't want to hear them. I turned around, walking faster than I meant to at first, then faster still. My feet hit the pavement harder, each step louder than the last, until I was almost jogging. I didn't stop until the curve in the road came into view, and I could see the faint glow of distant streetlights. When I finally reached the edge of town, I kept glancing back. I didn't see him again, but I couldn't shake the image of the way he had turned his head, just enough to let me know he was aware of me. The road beyond that curve still stretched into the dark, quiet distance, and somewhere in that silence was the narrow path he had taken. For the rest of the night, every time I thought about it, I kept coming back to the same thing. He hadn't been heading anywhere most people would go, and there was no reason for him to match my pace unless he wanted to. That dirt path had no lights, no houses, no reason to exist unless you already knew where it went. And now I knew there was someone out there who did. It was a little after 6 in the evening when I decided to take the long way home. The sun was already low, spilling a dull orange light over the horizon. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. I was walking along the dirt road that cut through a stretch of woods I'd never gone deep into before. I usually stuck to the paved streets closer to town, but I thought the quiet and the fresh air might help clear my head after a long day. The road wasn't much more than 2 narrow ruts, with weeds and grass growing tall between them. On both sides, the trees crowded in close, their branches weaving together overhead in some places. There were patches where sunlight broke through, painting the dirt in pale streaks, but most of the path was shadowed. I could smell damp leaves and the faint scent of pine. Somewhere far off, I could hear the slow drip of water, probably from last night's rain sliding off branches. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of wind moving through the leaves. Just the steady crunch of gravel and twigs under my boots. After a while, I noticed the road started to slope slightly downward, and the trees on the left side leaned in at an angle, their trunks stretching tall before vanishing into the dim canopy. On the right, the ground dropped off into a shallow ditch, overgrown with thorn bushes and tall grass. I figured it would level out eventually, so I kept going. It was when I reached the bend that I first felt something was off. It wasn't anything I could see, just a shift in the air. The stillness I'd noticed earlier felt heavier now, thicker, like the air was pressing in on me. My steps slowed without me even deciding to slow them. The road ahead curved out of sight, the shadows pooling thicker around it. I stood there for a second, looking at the dark bend, and realized I hadn't heard a single bird or insect in a while. Even the distant dripping sound had stopped. I pushed forward, telling myself I was just being stupid, that the silence was nothing. But as I came around the curve, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. About 20 feet ahead, on the left side of the road, there was a man. He was standing still, facing away from me, looking into the trees. His posture was stiff, like he was straining to hear something. He wasn't dressed for the woods, dark pants, a plain shirt, no backpack, no gear. I slowed my pace and tried to step quietly, though the crunch of gravel under my boots seemed far too loud in the silence. He didn't move. I kept walking, trying not to stare, my eyes scanning the trees like I was just looking at the scenery. But in my peripheral vision, I could see him clearly, hands hanging at his sides, head tilted slightly upward, completely still. There was something unnatural about how motionless he was. Not a twitch, not a shift of weight, nothing. As I drew closer, I realized he wasn't looking up at the trees. He was looking into them, deeper than I could see. His head was angled just enough that I couldn't see his face. My mind was buzzing with questions I didn't want to answer. Was he lost? Was he waiting for someone? Watching something? I passed him without slowing too much, forcing myself to keep my head forward. My neck prickled as I moved by, the kind of sensation that comes when you know someone's eyes are on you, even if you can't prove it. I told myself not to look back, but after I'd gone about 20 steps, I couldn't help it. He was still there. Only now, he was turned slightly, just enough that I could tell his head was following me. He still didn't move otherwise, just that tiny shift of his face toward my direction. I faced forward again, my heart rate climbing. I didn't run, not yet. Running felt like it would make too much noise, draw too much attention. I just kept my pace steady, each step feeling longer than the last. The road straightened out ahead, and I could see the light starting to fade faster as the trees thickened. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were faint at first, like the soft crush of dirt under careful steps, matching the rhythm of mine but just a half beat off. I glanced over my shoulder. The man was gone. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes sweeping the road behind me. Empty. My ears strained in the silence, and I caught it again, a footstep, off to the right, somewhere in the ditch. Then another. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting to the sides of the road. The tall grass shifted slightly in the ditch, like something was moving low through it. My hands were sweating, my breathing faster now, but I didn't want to break into a run until I knew for sure. The sound followed me. Every time my boots hit the ground, there was a delayed echo from the grass, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. It wasn't random, it was keeping pace. When the ditch ended and the ground leveled out again, I finally glanced sharply to my right, just a flicker of movement, something dark low, slipping between the trunks. It wasn't a full shape, just the shadow of one. I didn't think anymore. I started running. The road ahead was a blur of dirt and roots and scattered leaves. My lungs burned as I sprinted, the sound of my boots pounding in my ears. But underneath it, I could still hear the other footsteps, faster now, moving with me. They didn't sound heavy enough to be a deer or big animal. Too controlled. Too human. The trees on either side seemed to close in the faster I moved, their branches clawing at the fading light. My eyes were watering from the wind, my chest tight. I didn't dare look to the side again. Finally, through the trees, I caught a faint glow ahead, an opening where the road met the edge of the woods. I pushed harder, my legs screaming with the effort. The footsteps behind me quickened too, so close now I could almost feel them in the vibrations of the dirt. I broke out of the tree line into an open stretch of grass. The glow was from a porch light about 50 yards away, the first house I'd seen in miles. I didn't stop, didn't slow until I was nearly at the front steps. Only then did I glance back. The road was empty. The tree line behind it was still. I stood there, chest heaving, sweat running cold down my back. Whoever, or whatever, had been there was gone. But the ditch, the silence, the man, the footsteps, they were all burned into my head like they had been waiting for me all along. When I finally walked the rest of the way home, I stayed to the paved streets, under the streetlights, where the shadows didn't press so close and the silence didn't seem to breathe. I never took that dirt road again, and I never forgot the way those footsteps followed mine, always just a half beat behind. I remember the night clearly, the way the sky looked just before it turned completely dark, the smell of damp earth mixing with the cold breeze that crept through the trees. It was supposed to be a simple solo hike, just a few hours to clear my head, but what happened that night stayed with me long after I got back home, safe but shaken. I started my walk in the late afternoon, following a narrow trail that twisted and turned through the thick forest. The woods were dense, with tall pine and oak trees crowding the path. The light was soft, fading quickly as the sun dipped below the horizon. Birds chirped their last songs, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. The smell of wet leaves and pine needles filled the air. I was alone but felt calm at first, my footsteps muffled by the layer of old leaves and moss underfoot. As I went deeper, the path became less clear. Branches blocked some parts, and fallen logs forced me to step carefully. The light grew dimmer, and shadows stretched long. I reached a small clearing near a creek. Thin water trickling over smooth stones, the sound steady and gentle. I sat on a rock, letting the quiet calm wash over me, trying to relax. After a while, I noticed something odd, a faint sound, almost like a low breath or a whisper carried by the wind. I stopped moving, listening closely, but it was gone. I thought maybe it was just the wind shifting leaves or some small animal moving far away. I brushed it off and stood up to continue, heading along the creek. The trail narrowed here, squeezing between the creek on one side and a steep hill on the other. The ground underfoot was slippery with mud from recent rain. I had to move slowly to avoid falling. The woods felt thicker, darker, the air colder, even though it was still early evening. The feeling of being watched crept over me, subtle but growing stronger with every step. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, clearer this time, heavy breathing, uneven and quick, coming from just beyond the trees on the hillside. My heart jumped. I stopped and stared into the shadows. The trees moved with the wind, but I could see nothing. No shapes, no movement, just the dark trunks and thick brush. The sound stopped as suddenly as it came. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar, and tried to keep calm. Still, my pace quickened, and I stayed alert. The path twisted sharply now, and I had to climb over rocks and roots. My boots sank into the mud, and the chill in the air seeped through my jacket. The forest was so quiet now, no birds, no rustling animals, just the distant sound of the creek. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I stopped and looked, heart pounding in my chest. Nothing was there. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, reminding myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the feeling of being followed stayed. The sun finally disappeared, and the sky darkened to deep blue. My phone's light was almost dead, flickering weakly. I cursed myself for not bringing extra batteries or a flashlight. I turned it on briefly, scanning the path ahead. The light caught on the wet leaves, the uneven ground, and just beyond, the thick forest stretching into darkness. Then I heard it again, the breathing, louder this time, rough and close. My head snapped toward the sound. It was coming from just off the trail, in the shadows near a fallen tree. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. I held my breath, heart racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a slow step back, then another, trying not to make noise. My eyes darted around, searching the blackness. I thought about running, but the path behind me was narrow and uneven. If something was out there, running might trigger it. I remembered my survival training. Move calmly but quickly. The breathing stopped suddenly. Silence. Then, something shifted in the underbrush, a faint snapping of twigs, soft but definite. My mind jumped to every possible threat. Wild animal, a stranger, something worse. I gripped a sturdy stick I found nearby, holding it like a weapon. I moved forward cautiously, shining the fading light of my phone into the dark trees. The beam caught on a shape, something large and low to the ground. My breath hitched. It was a big dog, a stray maybe, eyes reflecting the light. It growled softly, then took a few steps back, disappearing into the woods. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I kept moving, but the feeling that something was still watching me never left. Every rustle, every shadow seemed alive, full of hidden eyes. Finally, I reached the edge of the forest. The path opened to a dirt road that led back toward the parking lot where I'd left my car. I quickened my pace, tired but desperate to get out. The cool night air felt cleaner, and the sounds of distant cars and voices made me feel safer. When I reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. I glanced back into the dark woods, still feeling eyes on me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled away, the headlights cutting a bright path through the night. Driving back, I kept replaying the night in my head, the heavy breathing, the eyes in the dark, the silent shadows. I thought about how easily things could have gone wrong out there alone, how small and vulnerable I was in that endless forest. That night taught me something important. Nature can be beautiful, peaceful, even healing, but it's also wild, unpredictable, and full of things that don't want to be found. It doesn't care about your plans or your comfort. Respect it, or it will remind you who's really in charge. Since then, I never go out alone without proper gear and a plan. I learned to listen to those little warnings, the sudden quiet, the feeling of being watched. They mean something. They saved me that night, and I'm grateful I made it out, because not everyone does. I had been driving most of the day, cutting through back roads to avoid traffic on the main highway. My phone battery had died hours earlier, and I was relying on an old paper map I'd found in the glove box to navigate. The sun was already low when I noticed the road narrowing, the pavement giving way to rough gravel. Tall trees pressed close on either side, their branches arching overhead to block out the last of the daylight. I told myself it was fine, that I'd be back on a proper road soon enough, but the longer I drove, the rougher it got. The gravel turned to dirt, and deep ruts shook the car every few feet. When I came to a fork in the road, the map in my lap didn't match what I was seeing. The left path looked wider, but it sloped sharply down toward a swampy patch of land. The right was narrower, but seemed to lead uphill. I chose the right, thinking higher ground would be safer, and kept going until the road ended abruptly in front of a metal gate. Beyond it was nothing but thick forest. I put the car in reverse, but the tires spun in the loose dirt before catching enough to pull back. A few minutes later, I was back at the fork. I took the other road this time, and after a few minutes, the ground leveled out. I passed an old mailbox leaning sideways on a rusted post, though there was no sign of a house. The road twisted for what felt like forever. The air was damp and heavy, the smell of wet leaves and mud filling the car. The sun was gone now, and the dim light filtering through the trees had faded into deep blue shadows. My headlights were the only thing cutting the darkness, but even they seemed weaker than usual, as if the forest was swallowing the light. I glanced at the fuel gauge and felt a twinge of unease. The needle hovered just above empty. I hadn't passed a gas station in over an hour. My plan was simple: find a wider road, follow it until I reached a small town, fill up, and get back on track. But the road kept winding deeper, with no signs, no intersections, and no way to turn around without backing into the trees. The first real sign of life came as a faint glow through the trees, far off the road. I slowed the car, craning my neck to see better. It wasn't moving like headlights, more like a steady yellow light, low to the ground, as if from a lantern. I thought maybe it was a porch light, which meant there could be a house nearby where I could ask for directions. I pulled off as much as I could to the side of the narrow road, grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, and stepped out. The night air was colder than I expected, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no wind in the leaves, just the crunch of my own footsteps on the damp ground. The light in the distance flickered faintly as I walked toward it, weaving between the trees and trying not to trip over the uneven ground. It took longer to reach than I thought. My legs were beginning to ache from climbing over fallen branches when I finally saw it clearly: a single, old-fashioned oil lamp hanging from a nail on the side of a shed. The shed was small, its wood gray and warped with age. The door hung slightly open, revealing only darkness inside. The strangest thing was how isolated it was. There was no path leading to it, no signs of a nearby house or driveway. Just this shed, sitting alone in the woods with a lit lamp on the wall. I felt an uncomfortable prickle run down my spine. It didn't make sense for someone to keep a lamp burning out here, unless they were close by. I waited, listening for footsteps or voices, but there was nothing. I considered calling out, but something stopped me. The quiet was too heavy, and my own breathing felt too loud. I decided to turn back. But when I retraced my steps, I realized I couldn't see the road anymore. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark in a narrow cone, but the trees all looked the same. I walked faster, trying to follow what I thought was the way I came, until I stumbled into a shallow ditch. My ankle twisted painfully, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. I stopped to catch my breath, looking around, and saw something that made my stomach tighten. Just a few feet away was a boot print in the mud. It was fresh, edges sharp, water still pooled in the deeper grooves. But it wasn't mine. I swung the flashlight beam in a slow arc. About 20 feet away, between two trees, I caught the faint outline of someone standing still. My heart hammered. I couldn't see their face, only a vague human shape, unmoving, watching me. I froze, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then the figure shifted, stepping just out of the light, vanishing into the darkness. I heard nothing, not a snap of a twig, not a rustle of leaves. I backed away, keeping the light sweeping in every direction, until I finally caught sight of the road's pale dirt through the trees. Relief surged, and I limped toward it as fast as I could. When I reached the car, the driver's side door was open. I was certain I had shut it. My bag, which I'd left on the passenger seat, was gone. The keys were still in the ignition. I didn't waste time thinking. I jumped in, slammed the door, and started the engine. The car lurched forward, tires spitting dirt as I sped down the road, not caring about the ruts or the low fuel warning now flashing red. I drove until I saw the glow of a gas station sign through the trees. I pulled in, my hands trembling, and sat there for several minutes before getting out. I never told the attendant what happened. I just filled the tank, bought a new map, and took the main road home. Later, when I thought about it, what unsettled me most wasn't the figure in the woods or the open car door. It was the fact that I had walked in a straight line to the shed and a straight line back. Or at least I thought I had. But somehow, the road was in a completely different place than where I expected it to be. And somewhere in those trees, someone had been close enough to take my bag without me hearing a single sound. It started on a warm but overcast afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels heavy even without rain. I had driven out to a rural area to take photographs of an abandoned railway bridge I'd heard about from a coworker. The bridge was supposed to be deep in the woods, far off the main road, and I wanted to get shots before sunset. My plan was simple: park near the dirt track, hike in, get the pictures, and get back to the car before dark. The road leading there was narrow, the kind where two cars would struggle to pass each other. Grass grew thick in the center strip of the dirt, and the edges dropped sharply into ditches choked with weeds and stagnant water. My tires crunched over loose gravel as I slowed to find a place to pull over. On either side, the trees were so dense they seemed to lean inward over the road, blocking out most of the sky. The daylight already felt thinner than it should have for the hour. I found a wide patch of dirt and pulled in, shutting off the engine. The silence hit me immediately. No hum of distant traffic, no voices, not even birdsong. Just the faint rustle of leaves somewhere far up in the canopy. I got my backpack out, slung my camera around my neck, and started down the faint trail that branched off from the road. The dirt under my boots was soft, covered with a thick layer of last year's leaves that muffled my steps. The path was barely visible in places, more a suggestion than an actual trail. It twisted between trunks, some so close together I had to turn sideways to slip through. Every so often, I passed old railway spikes rusting in the dirt, and once a half-buried length of rail, so covered in moss it blended almost completely with the ground. I figured I was getting close. About 20 minutes in, I saw the bridge through the trees. It was old steel, painted green once, but now almost completely stripped by rust and weather. It crossed a shallow ravine where a trickle of water glinted between dark stones. The air here smelled damp, the way it does after rain, even though it hadn't rained all day. I walked out onto the bridge slowly, the metal creaking faintly under my weight. From the center, I could see both ways down the ravine, just endless trees in every direction. I started taking pictures, focusing on the details. Peeling paint, the tangled vines climbing up from below, the graffiti scratched into the steel beams. That's when I noticed it. Down in the ravine, on the far side where the slope was steep and rocky, there was movement. I lowered the camera and squinted, trying to make out what it was. It wasn't an animal, not from the way it moved. It was slow, deliberate, not the quick darting of a deer or raccoon. I thought maybe it was another person, but whoever it was seemed to be crouched low, half hidden by a boulder. I waited for them to stand or come into view, but they didn't. They just stayed there, motionless except for the faint shift of their head, like they were looking right at me. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I took a step back from the railing. It could have been nothing, maybe a hiker resting, maybe even some trash caught on a rock that my brain was turning into a shape. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finished taking a few more photos quickly and decided to head back. On the walk out, I kept checking behind me. The trail felt different now, narrower somehow, the trees pressing closer. Every creak of a branch or crack of a twig made me turn my head. I couldn't see anyone, but the sensation that I wasn't alone followed me all the way back to the car. When I stepped out of the woods, my relief was sharp and physical, like dropping a heavy weight. The car sat right where I'd left it, the metal warm from the lingering heat of the day. I climbed in, tossed my backpack into the passenger seat, and started the engine. I had just put the car in gear when something made me freeze. In the rearview mirror, just for a second before I pulled away, I saw the figure. Standing at the tree line where the trail met the road, completely still. Too far to see their face, but close enough to tell they were tall, shoulders slightly hunched, arms hanging loosely at their sides. I didn't wait to get a better look. My foot pressed the gas harder than I meant to, and the car jolted forward. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to check the mirror again until I was miles away. That night, I went through the photos on my computer. Most were ordinary, rust, leaves, sky through steel beams. But in one, taken on the bridge, down in the corner of the frame, there was a blur of pale color against the dark rocks. Not enough detail to make out a face, but enough to know it was there before I'd even realized. I didn't go back to that place. I didn't even drive that road again. The photos went into a folder I haven't opened since. And still sometimes when I'm walking alone, on a sidewalk, through a parking lot, even in daylight, I'll get that same prickling at the back of my neck. The same sense that if I turn quickly enough, I might catch someone standing perfectly still, just far enough away to make me doubt what I saw. And I know if I ever do see them up close, it won't be the first time they've seen me. I didn't expect much when I agreed to go hiking alone that morning. It was just supposed to be a simple day trip, a break from the noise of the city, some fresh air, a chance to clear my head. I had my backpack, enough water and snacks for the day, a basic first aid kit, and a map of the trails. Nothing fancy. The weather was clear, a little chilly but comfortable under the early sun. I parked my car at the trailhead just after 8 a.m., took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and set off. The trail was mostly dirt, winding through thick forest with occasional patches of open meadow. The ground was damp in spots from recent rain, but the path was firm enough. I felt good, steady. I kept an even pace, enjoying the quiet around me, only the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls breaking the silence. No one else was around, which I liked. Sometimes, you need to be alone with your thoughts. The first few miles went by without incident. I stopped once to take a drink and eat a granola bar. The sun climbed higher, filtering down through the branches and warming the forest floor. The trail started to climb gently, leading me toward a ridge that offered views of the valley below. I looked forward to that, the kind of sight that makes the climb worth it. As I neared the ridge, I noticed something odd. A faint trail splitting off to the right, narrower and less worn, heading deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on my map. I hesitated, but then shook it off. I had my map. I'd stick to the main trail. Still, curiosity nagged at me. At the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath and look out. The valley stretched wide, a patchwork of fields and forest, the river winding silver in the distance. The view was stunning. I pulled out my phone to snap a photo. Then I saw it, something moving on the far side of the ridge, a figure. At first, I thought it was a hiker, but as it moved, it felt strange. The figure was hunched, walking oddly, not like a person. My skin prickled. I scanned the area, but no one else was visible. The figure disappeared behind a tree. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe a deer or some other animal. I turned back to the trail. That's when I realized my phone battery was dead. I hadn't checked it after taking that first photo. No signal either. Just the forest and me. I decided to continue along the ridge. The trail became steeper, the trees thicker. The air smelled fresher here, cooler. I felt the thrill of being so far from civilization, but also a small knot of unease. I reached a small clearing near the top, where a fallen log lay across the path. As I stepped over it, I heard something, a sharp crack from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sound of branches breaking underfoot, more like a heavy thud. I froze, listening. Nothing else. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or something bigger. Still, I was careful to keep moving. The trail looped around the ridge and began to descend into a denser section of forest. That's when things started to feel wrong. The path became less clear. The underbrush thickened, thorny branches scraping my arms and legs. I had to watch my step more closely. The daylight was fading faster than I expected, even though it was only mid-afternoon. I stopped to drink from my water bottle. The silence was too thick now. No birds singing, no wind stirring the leaves. Even my breathing sounded loud. I felt exposed and small in the middle of all those towering trees. Suddenly, I heard it again, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was my heartbeat, but it wasn't steady. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, but I couldn't tell how far away. I picked up my pace. The trail wasn't straight anymore, curving and dipping, twisting around thick roots and moss-covered rocks. My boots slipped on wet leaves. I glanced back. Nothing, just shadows between the trees. The thumping stopped. I slowed down, chest tight, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was just scaring myself. Maybe it was a branch falling or some animal moving far away. I told myself to focus. Then I tripped on a root and landed hard on my right knee. Pain shot through my leg, sharp and burning. I cursed softly, careful not to make too much noise. I sat still for a moment, feeling the sting, then wiped the dirt and leaves off my pants. I knew I should check for injury, but I was more worried about what might be behind me. I listened again. Silence. I got up slowly and tested my weight on my leg. It hurt, but I could walk. Good enough. I kept moving, slower now. The trail curved sharply, and the trees thinned a bit, revealing a faint light up ahead, maybe the end of the trail or an opening. Relieved, I headed toward it. As I stepped into the light, I found myself at the edge of a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across. The ground was muddy and uneven, scattered with broken branches and flattened grass. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, deep impressions in the mud, bigger than any bear or deer tracks I'd seen. They led into the woods from the opposite side and disappeared between the trees where the shadows were thickest. My heart hammered in my chest. These weren't animal tracks I recognized. They were too big, too heavy. I swallowed hard and took a step back, but my foot slipped in the mud and I almost fell again. The air felt colder, heavier. I glanced around, trying to find a way out, but the path back was blocked by fallen branches and thick bushes that hadn't been there before. Panic surged. I started moving faster, looking for another route. The forest was dense, tangled with vines and trees packed close together. The light faded, leaving me in near darkness. I stopped to catch my breath and pulled out my flashlight, but the batteries were dead. I cursed again. No phone, no light, and no way to find my way. I remembered the tracks and thought maybe whoever, or whatever, made them might still be nearby. I listened. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and moved forward blindly. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scraping my face and hands. My clothes were torn and muddy. Suddenly, I heard it, a deep, heavy breathing right behind me. I froze. The sound was close, slow, and labored. I turned quickly, but saw nothing except thick trees and shadow. The breathing stopped. I stood still, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. I decided to climb a tree, any tree, to get a better view and maybe stay safe for a while. I found a sturdy pine with low branches and started climbing. My leg ached, but I pushed up, pulling myself higher until I was about 10 feet off the ground. From here, I could see a bit better. The moon had risen, casting pale light through the canopy. I spotted the trail leading back toward the ridge, but it was far and winding. I could hear twigs snapping below. Then I saw it, a large figure moving slowly among the trees. It wasn't running, just walking with heavy steps. It stopped and looked up at me. I could see the shape clearly now. Huge shoulders, thick arms, but not quite human. The way it moved was awkward, lumbering, almost animalistic. Fear gripped me. I was trapped up here with no way down that felt safe. The figure stayed below for what felt like an hour, pacing and sniffing the air. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Eventually, it started to move away, disappearing into the shadows. I waited another long time before climbing down slowly. My leg was stiff, but I managed. I took the trail back toward the ridge, careful and quiet, my senses on edge. The forest seemed different now, darker, colder. I walked for what felt like miles, the trail getting steeper as I climbed back. At last, I reached the top and saw the parking lot far below, lights from cars and buildings shining faintly. I ran down the last stretch, my breath ragged, my legs screaming with every step. When I finally got to my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I sat inside, shaking, my mind racing. I thought about what I'd seen and heard, the footprints, the breathing, the figure. I realized that whatever was out there wasn't just some animal or lost hiker. It was something wild, something that belonged deep in these woods. I started the engine and didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tight. The memory of those heavy footsteps and that quiet breathing stayed with me for days afterward. I never went back to that trail. Some places are better left alone. The night came on faster than I expected. I was out there alone, deep in the woods, far from any kind of trail or sign of civilization. I had set out earlier that afternoon, planning just a short hike to clear my head and enjoy some quiet. The sun was warm and the sky was clear, a perfect day for being outside. I left my phone off and my pack light, just a small bottle of water, some granola bars, a flashlight, and a pocket knife I carried out of habit. I told myself I didn't want to bring anything unnecessary. At first, the walk was peaceful. The forest around me was thick with tall pines and maples, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. The ground was carpeted with pine needles and fallen leaves, soft under my boots. I could hear birds chirping, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the branches, the distant sound of a creek flowing somewhere off to my right. The air smelled fresh, with a sharpness that only the woods can carry after a dry day. Everything felt calm and safe. As the afternoon slipped toward evening, I found a small clearing beside a shallow creek. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I sat on a fallen log and pulled out a granola bar. I watched the light change through the trees, turning the leaves golden, stretching long shadows across the ground. The peace settled over me again, and I almost forgot I was alone. But the woods don't stay peaceful once the light fades. I started back toward where I thought the trailhead was. I didn't want to be out here after dark. I figured it would be a quick walk back. The forest seemed denser now, the trees pressing in close as I moved deeper. The creek disappeared under the brush, and the sounds of water faded. The sun was dipping low, and soon the sky darkened, bleeding from gold into red, then purple. I switched on my flashlight. The beam cut a narrow circle of yellow light through the dark woods, but beyond that everything was black. The flashlight didn't make me feel safer. It made me realize how deep in the shadows I was, how easily something could be lurking just outside the reach of the light. I tried to keep my breathing steady, my footsteps quiet on the leaf-covered ground. Every snap of a twig underfoot or rustle in the bushes made my heart jump. My mind played tricks on me, imagining eyes watching from the dark or something moving just beyond the trees. I told myself it was just nerves, just my imagination. After a while, the trail seemed to vanish. I could no longer tell where I was heading. I stopped and looked around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The forest was a wall of trunks and branches, tangled roots and fallen logs. The path I had been following had disappeared under a thick covering of leaves and pine needles. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. My heart sank. I realized I was lost. The temperature dropped quickly. The cold settled in my bones as I kept moving, trying to find something, a trail, a clearing, any sign of the way out. The flashlight battery was getting weak. The beam flickered now and then, forcing me to shake it or press the button repeatedly. Each time it dimmed, the darkness seemed to stretch closer. Then I heard it, a low noise, almost like a whisper. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something soft and steady, moving through the underbrush nearby. I stopped. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then it started again, a slow crunch of dry leaves and twigs coming closer. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't move forward either. The sound was definitely approaching, slow and steady, like someone or something following me. I fumbled for my pocket knife, gripping it tightly. My hands were trembling. The crunching grew louder. Then suddenly it stopped. I stood frozen. The silence around me was heavy and thick, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I scanned the edges of the flashlight's beam, searching for any movement. Then I saw it, a shape tall and dark, just beyond the reach of my light. It was standing still, barely moving, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I tried to steady the light again and saw more clearly. The shape was too tall to be a deer or any animal I knew. It was standing upright, and it didn't have the shapes or features of a human. But it wasn't a ghost or monster. There was nothing supernatural here. Just something unknown and terrifying because it shouldn't be here. Then I remembered the stories I'd heard about people getting lost and never coming out of these woods. How sometimes others come looking, but they don't find the missing. How the forest can swallow you whole, leaving no trace. I felt the cold seep deeper into me, mixing with a raw, growing fear. The figure began to move, slow and deliberate, stepping toward me through the dark. I could see the faint outline of its limbs, the way it bent slightly, almost like it was hiding, stalking. My flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into complete darkness. Panic surged. I ran. Branches slapped my face and arms, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't care. I just ran blindly, trying to get away, to find the path back. My breath was ragged and loud in my ears. I stumbled over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees on the dirt and rocks. I forced myself up and kept going, guided only by the faint glow of the night sky through the canopy. The shape was behind me, I could feel it. I didn't look back. Then out of nowhere, I crashed through a thick wall of bushes and hit a slope. I slid down a short embankment and landed on a flat, open space. The moon was bright here, illuminating a small clearing. I collapsed, gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the figure. I stayed there, shivering, listening. The forest was quiet again, except for the usual night sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The fear was still there, tight and heavy, but the worst seemed to have passed. After what felt like hours, I gathered my strength. I looked around the clearing and noticed a faint dirt road cutting through the trees, just a few feet beyond the edge of the clearing. It was narrow and barely visible, but it was there. I stood and took a careful step onto the road. The ground underfoot was hard-packed dirt, not the soft, leaf-strewn forest floor. I moved cautiously but steadily, following the road as it wound through the trees. The forest seemed less hostile now, less threatening. I told myself I wasn't imagining things, that what I had seen wasn't some creature or demon. It was probably just someone or something lost too, maybe a hunter or a drifter. But the fear stayed with me, gnawing at my skin. I walked the road for a long time, the moonlight guiding my steps. Eventually, I heard the distant sound of a car engine. Relief washed over me. I hurried toward the noise and soon found a small gravel parking area with an old pickup truck parked there. The driver was nowhere in sight, but the keys were in the ignition. I sat inside, shivering and exhausted. I started the engine and let it run, my eyes darting around the parking lot and the tree line. After a few minutes, I spotted a pair of headlights coming down the road. The truck rolled to a stop beside me. A man stepped out, looking concerned when he saw me. I was too tired and shaken to explain much, just nodded and pointed back toward the woods. He gave me some water and helped me call for help. I waited there for what felt like forever until someone came to get me. That night, as I lay in a warm bed, safe and far away from the forest, I thought about what happened. I realized how easily the woods could swallow someone whole, how quickly peace can turn into fear. The figure I saw might have been real, or maybe my mind twisted what little I could see. But the feeling, the weight of being hunted, lost, and alone, was all too real. The next morning, I returned with a search team to mark the trail and find where I had lost my way. They told me the forest around there was known for getting thick and confusing, especially after storms when trails get washed out. They also warned me about people who wander off, some not coming back. I never went back alone after that, and I made sure to carry a GPS and extra supplies whenever I went hiking. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I still remember that night. The cold air, the shape in the dark, the sound of footsteps behind me. It reminds me how quickly nature can turn from peaceful to dangerous, and how small we really are when the forest closes in. That night didn't have a neat, happy ending. It was messy and frightening, but it ended with me alive, and that's what matters. The woods aren't full of monsters or ghosts, just the quiet, patient wild. And sometimes that's scary enough. I remember the day started like any other. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a chance to escape the city noise and spend some time alone in the wilderness. The sky was clear, the sun bright but not harsh, and the air held that fresh, earthy smell that only forests have after a light rain. I parked my car at the small trailhead, pulled my pack tighter, checked my map one last time, and stepped onto the dirt path that snaked its way through towering pines and thick underbrush. The forest was alive with the quiet sounds of nature, birds calling, leaves rustling gently in the breeze, a distant woodpecker tapping rhythmically on a tree trunk. The path was well-worn but not crowded. I liked that. I wanted silence, solitude. As I walked, my boots softly crushed the pine needles underfoot, the scent of damp earth growing stronger with every step. My pack felt comfortable, not too heavy, carrying only what I needed. Water, some snacks, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and my phone, though I knew the signal would likely vanish once I ventured deeper. After an hour, the trail dipped down into a narrow ravine where the trees grew closer together. The sunlight struggled to filter through the thick canopy, casting long, shifting shadows across the moss-covered rocks and twisted roots. Here, the air felt cooler, damper. I stopped to take a sip of water, breathing in the crisp scent, when I noticed something odd: broken branches off the trail, some trampled ferns. It looked like something large had passed through recently. I shrugged it off. Animals do that all the time. But a small chill crawled up my spine. I reminded myself I was prepared, that the forest was mostly harmless, and I had done my research. The trail wound upward again, opening to a ridge that overlooked a broad valley. The view was stunning, rolling hills covered in green, a ribbon of river winding through the trees like a silver thread. I sat on a fallen log to rest and eat a bit of trail mix. The quiet was complete except for the occasional call of a hawk far above. It was while I was packing up that I noticed a figure moving along the ridge on the far side of the valley. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something felt off. The person walked steadily, almost too deliberately, and didn't seem to be following any obvious trail. They wore dark clothing that blended with the trees, and their movements were slow and controlled, like they were watching or searching for something. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the distance was too great. Unease began to creep in. I told myself it was probably just someone else enjoying the hike, maybe lost or taking an odd route. I took a deep breath and stood up, deciding to keep moving rather than dwell on it. The trail descended toward a small creek, the sound of running water growing louder with each step. Crossing the creek was easy. The water was shallow, and the stones provided a natural stepping path. On the other side, the forest grew thicker. The trees were older, their trunks wider and bark rougher, covered in patches of lichen and moss. The sunlight dimmed under the dense canopy. My boots sunk slightly into soft mud as I followed the winding path, and the air smelled of wet leaves and decaying wood. As I walked, the feeling of being watched returned. I stopped frequently, scanning the undergrowth. There was no one in sight. Only the natural sounds remained, the occasional snap of a twig, the flutter of a bird startled by my presence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I wasn't alone. After about 30 minutes, I reached a small clearing where the remains of an old cabin stood. The structure was barely recognizable, with walls collapsed and the roof sagging, swallowed by vines and moss. Curiosity pushed me closer. I circled the ruins, noticing old rusted cans and broken glass scattered in the dirt. The place looked abandoned for decades. I pulled out my phone to snap a quick photo, but the screen flickered and went black. I tried again. Nothing. The battery indicator still showed some life, but the screen refused to turn on. Frustrated, I shoved the phone back into my pack. No signal, no power. It was useless here. I looked around one last time, then turned to retrace my steps. The sun was already lower in the sky, and shadows stretched long and deep between the trees. The forest seemed colder now, and the silence heavier. I picked up my pace. That's when I heard it, the crack of a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I froze. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears. Nothing, just the distant call of a crow. I took a few steps, then another snap. Closer this time. I started walking faster, trying to keep calm. The trail twisted through the trees, and I was confident I knew the way back. But then I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd passed a certain landmark. The old oak tree with the carved initials wasn't anywhere to be seen. Panic started to settle in. I stopped and tried to get my bearings. The forest looked unfamiliar, like I'd wandered off the trail without realizing. Every tree looked the same, every shadow deep and foreboding. I reached for my map, but my hands trembled too much to hold it steady. I decided to keep moving in the direction I thought would lead back to the creek crossing. The sun was dipping behind the horizon now, and the forest was losing its last light. I pulled out my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and patches of low-hanging moss. More cracks and rustles came from the woods around me, not all at the same time but scattered, almost like footsteps. My breath came faster, and I told myself to stay calm. It was probably animals, maybe deer or raccoons moving about. Still, the feeling of eyes on me intensified. It was no longer just the feeling. I caught glimpses of movement between trees, something dark and low, too big to be a deer. My mind raced. Could it be a bear? A mountain lion? I wasn't prepared for a close encounter with any large predator. I kept the flashlight pointed ahead, trying not to stumble on roots or rocks. The beam caught on something, footprints in the mud, fresh and large. They looked human, but the size and depth of the prints suggested a heavy person, or someone carrying something bulky. My skin prickled. Whoever had passed through here was close, maybe still nearby. Then, not far ahead, I saw the faint glow of a campfire, flickering weakly. Relief flooded me. Someone was there. Maybe they could help me get back on the trail, or at least share some warmth until morning. I moved cautiously toward the light, my steps soft against the forest floor. The fire was small, barely alive, surrounded by scattered logs and a few empty cans. No one was sitting by it. Suddenly, a twig snapped sharply behind me. I whipped around, shining the light into the dark, but saw nothing. I took a step back toward the fire, but then noticed something on the ground, a knife, its blade smeared with dirt, and something darker that glistened faintly in the firelight. Fear gripped me tightly. This wasn't just a lost hiker. Something else was going on here. I stuffed the knife into my pack, not wanting to touch it, and scanned the surrounding woods again. The sounds were closer now, the rustling, footsteps, snapping twigs. I didn't want to look, but forced myself to check. In the dim glow, I thought I saw a shadow moving swiftly behind a thick tree trunk, vanishing before I could get a clear look. I swallowed hard and knew I had to get out of there fast. I turned away from the fire and started running, using the flashlight to guide my steps. The trail was rough and uneven, and my feet stumbled over roots. The heavy breaths I took mixed with the pounding of my heart. Behind me, I heard running, quick, uneven, like someone chasing but not trained. I dared a glance over my shoulder. A figure, tall and dark, was closing in, moving between the trees with surprising speed. The face was hidden in shadows, but the body language screamed danger. I ran harder, adrenaline pushing me beyond exhaustion. Branches slapped my face, thorns tore at my jacket, but I didn't stop. The forest blurred around me, a maze of dark shapes and noises. Then, my foot caught on a root, and I fell hard. Pain shot through my wrist and knee. I scrambled up, ignoring the stinging cuts, and kept running, tears stinging my eyes. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I reached a steep incline and scrambled up, hands clawing at loose soil. Near the top, the ground gave way slightly, and I slid partway down but caught myself on a low branch. Breathing heavily, I looked back. The figure was below, just starting to climb, but slower now. The slope was too steep, the footing poor. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. Then I spotted something, an old service road running along the ridge, barely visible under leaves and branches. If I could reach it, I might find a way back to the main trail, or at least get higher where Cell's signal might return. I forced my legs to move, scrambling up to the road. My flashlight flickered, then died, leaving me in near-complete darkness. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my phone, pressing the power button, still nothing. I was truly alone. I moved along the road, stepping carefully, feeling my way by the faint moonlight. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, but the silence was almost worse, too complete. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, in the distance, I heard a vehicle. A truck's engine, low and steady. I quickened my pace, hoping to catch sight of it. The road curved, and suddenly headlights cut through the trees. I waved my arms, shouting silently, hoping they'd see me. The truck slowed and stopped. A man got out and shone a flashlight in my direction. Relief washed over me in a rush so strong I nearly collapsed. The man helped me into the truck, wrapping me in a blanket. On the way back to